Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The wind whistled through the towering pines, drowning out most of the night noises, but there was something else. A distinct rhythm beneath the wind, something that didn't belong. It was heavy, deliberate, almost like footsteps trying to mimic the natural cadence of the forest. I felt my skin prickle, and my senses sharpened in response. Alone in an isolated area of Yosemite on a moonless night, the feeling of not being alone suddenly weighed down on me. My flashlight beam bounced off the forest floor as I moved cautiously down the trail, the leaves crunching beneath my boots. It wasn't supposed to be a long patrol, just a check around the perimeter after a hiker reported some strange noises. I'd expected a mountain lion, maybe a bear, nothing I couldn't handle, not with the rifle slung over my shoulder and years of experience in these woods. But this felt different. Suddenly the sound stopped. The crunching that had mirrored my steps ceased, as if whoever, whatever was following me knew I was onto them. I paused, turning slowly, shining the flashlight in a wide arc. The trees swayed, casting dark shadows, but something caught my eye. Just beyond the edges of the light, there was movement, a huge shadow melting away like it had never been there at all. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice bouncing back to me in the oppressive quiet. No response. My ears strained for the smallest of sounds, but there was nothing. The sudden silence was even more unsettling than the noise had been. No insects, no nocturnal animals scuttling through the underbrush. Nothing but the gentle rustle of wind above. I felt the weight of my rifle shift as I adjusted my stance, my heart pounding against my ribcage. The scent of pine and damp earth hung thick in the air, and a cold sweat started to bead on my forehead. I knew these woods. They had always been predictable, a sanctuary away from the chaos of people. But tonight, they felt unfamiliar, alive in a way I couldn't quite understand. Then, the sound returned, closer this time, the snap of a branch, deliberate, echoing in the stillness. I swung the flashlight around, catching just a glimpse of something moving, something taller than any bear I'd ever seen, its silhouette obscured by the tree trunks. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm armed!" Silence again. My breath came in short puffs, the cold air biting my throat. I stepped forward, trying to ignore the voice in my head telling me to turn back, to get out while I still could. Something about the situation felt wrong, a primal wrongness that gnawed at my gut. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl but deeper, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't like any animal noise I knew. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I squinted into the darkness, desperate to see what was hiding in the shadows. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it move again. A shape, massive and upright, weaving between the trunks like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. My flashlight barely caught it before it was gone again, slipping away as if toying with me, keeping just out of reach. "Enough of this," I muttered under my breath. My voice sounded small, absurd in the face of what I was seeing, or almost seeing. I turned on my radio, static crackling before I found the channel. "Base! This is Brad. I've got something unidentified moving near the north perimeter, requesting backup," the reply came, garbled but clear enough. "Copy that, Brad. Can you identify the animal?" I hesitated, my eyes still scanning the woods, flashlight dancing from one shadow to the next. "Negative. I'm not sure what it is." "Roger that. Back up on the way. Stay put. Stay put." Right. I had half a mind to turn around and make my way back to the station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out here wasn't going to just let me leave. It wanted something, and it wasn't afraid to make its presence known. The growl came again, reverberating through the trees, closer now. I gripped my rifle, the metal cold against my palms, and forced myself to take a step forward. I had to see it. I had to know what was out there. "Show yourself!" I yelled, my voice echoing, bouncing off the trees like a challenge. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the wind, the cold, the sense of dread pressing in on me from all sides. And then, from behind a cluster of pines, it emerged. The beam of my flashlight hit it directly, and I froze. It stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur that looked almost black in the dim light. Its eyes glinted, reflecting the beam, and for a split second we locked eyes. There was something behind those eyes, something intelligent, something assessing. It made a noise, a low, rumbling growl that almost sounded like a warning. My finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, but I didn't pull. There was something about the creature, the way it stood there, unflinching, that made me hesitate. It wasn't attacking, it was just watching. "What the hell are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The creature shifted, its gaze never leaving mine, and then, slowly, it turned. It moved with an odd grace, disappearing into the forest with long, purposeful strides, the trees swallowing it whole. The growling stopped, the weight of its presence lifting, leaving only the cold and the wind and my own shaky breath. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight beam fixed on the spot where it had vanished. My radio crackled to life, a voice breaking through the fog in my mind. "Brad, status update. Backups approaching your location." I swallowed hard, bringing the radio to my lips. Base, whatever it was, it's gone. I'm heading back to meet the team." "Copy that. Stay safe," I exhaled, lowering my rifle and flashlight. The forest felt different now, like it had gone back to normal, as if whatever had been here had taken the strange silence with it. I started back down the trail, each step measured, every crunch of leaves beneath my boots loud in the quiet. When the backup team arrived, 2 other rangers in a truck, I could barely find the words to explain what had happened. How could I? I didn't know what I had seen. A bear on 2 legs, a trick of the light, or something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the neat categories of known wildlife. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Dan, one of the rangers, said as I climbed into the truck. I shook my head, glancing back toward the dark woods. "Maybe I have," I muttered, rubbing a hand over my face. "Let's just get out of here." As we drove back toward the ranger station, the forest closed in around us, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. I stared out the window, my eyes scanning the trees, half expecting to see that towering figure watching us from the shadows. But there was nothing, just darkness, and the memory of those eyes, intelligent, aware, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something that left me with the unsettling feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever it was, it knew me now, and somehow I knew I'd see it again. Story 2. The air was heavy, almost still, as I walked deeper into the Appalachian woods, the late afternoon sun casting long, eerie shadows on the trail. I was alone, and I loved it that way. The forest, usually my peaceful escape from the chaos of life, was different that day. It felt charged, electric. I had walked this trail dozens of times, but I had never felt anything quite like this before. It started when I noticed the footprints. The trail was muddy from the rain 2 nights before, and at first they seemed like nothing more than unusually large boot prints. But the more I looked, the less sense they made. They were huge, clearly outlined in the earth, toes defined, not boot treads. I remember standing there for a moment, puzzled, a chill creeping up my spine despite the late summer heat. "Is someone messing around out here?" I muttered, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the woods. My eyes darted around the quiet forest, but everything was still. too still. No rustling leaves, no birds singing, just the crunch of my boots on the gravelly path as I resumed my hike, my heart rate just a beat faster than before. As the day wore on, the sun sank lower, and I decided to pick up my pace. The plan was to make it to a small clearing with a stunning view of the sunset, pitch my tent, and enjoy the peace and quiet overnight. I'd done it plenty of times before, but with each step deeper into the forest, I felt more unease setting in. It was as if the trees were crowding in closer, the shadows lengthening faster than they should. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with every minute, and then I heard it. A sharp snap, like a heavy foot breaking a branch, just off the trail to my left. My heart jumped into my throat as I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears. Silence. The kind that presses down on you until it's almost unbearable. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure why. I wasn't expecting an answer, and I didn't want one either. There was no response, just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the trees. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the growing tension knotting my stomach. "It's just an animal, probably a deer," I told myself, though the footprints I'd seen earlier flashed through my mind again. Something didn't feel right. I started moving again, faster this time. My boots crunched rhythmically against the gravel, but then I heard it, a heavy, deliberate crunch from somewhere behind me, echoing my steps. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, listening. The sound stopped. Slowly, I turned, my eyes scanning the thick forest, but there was nothing, just trees, tall and silent, looming like sentinels. I forced myself to laugh, though it came out shaky. "Get it together, Sarah," I whispered, turning back to the trail, but the unease had settled into my bones now, and I couldn't shake it. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that something was out there, something that I couldn't see. As twilight descended, the woods grew darker, and the shadows deepened. The noises started again, the soft rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs, and then a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. I stopped again, every hair on my body standing on end. This time, I didn't call out. I just stood there, heart hammering, listening to the sound drift through the woods, closer, then fading away. Panic clawed at me, and I felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to run. My rational mind tried to keep me calm. I knew running would only make me vulnerable, that whatever it was could easily chase me down if it wanted to. But the primal part of my brain was screaming at me to get out, to move, to run and not look back. I turned and started walking quickly, almost jogging, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The path twisted ahead of me, a narrow ribbon between the darkening trees, and I could barely see 10 feet in front of me now. The noises kept pace, branches breaking, something large moving through the underbrush. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind me was playing with me, testing me, deciding whether or not I was worth the chase. Suddenly, there was a deep, guttural growl, closer than it had ever been, vibrating through my chest like a low drum. My instincts took over. I ran. I bolted down the path, branches whipping at my face, the forest blurring around me. I heard something behind me, something heavy crashing through the underbrush, matching my frantic pace. "No, no, no," I gasped, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my feet and the roaring in my ears. The path twisted sharply, and I nearly lost my footing, my hand grazing the bark of a tree as I turned. The road was close. I knew it. I just had to make it a little farther. My lungs burned, my legs screaming for me to stop, but I pushed on, my vision narrowing. Everything around me fading except for the desperate need to get away. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the forest opened up. The gravel path spilled out onto the asphalt road, and I stumbled to a stop, doubling over, my breath ragged and harsh in the night air. I turned, half expecting to see something burst out of the woods after me, but there was nothing, just the silent, dark wall of trees, standing as if they hadn't just spat me out like a terrified animal. My heart thundered in my chest, my entire body trembling, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting. But whatever had been following me was gone, swallowed up by the woods. Slowly, I took a step back, then another, until I was standing fully on the road, the forest looming behind me like a living thing. I didn't camp that night. I kept walking, following the road, my eyes darting back to the woods every few steps, listening for any sign that I was still being followed. The air was cold now, biting against my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between me and whatever was out there as possible. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance, the faint hum of an engine growing louder. I stepped into the middle of the road, waving my arms, and the car slowed to a stop. A middle-aged man leaned out the window, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes flicking from my disheveled appearance to the dark woods behind me. I swallowed hard, nodding, though I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. Can you give me a ride?" I managed, my voice cracking. "Please, just anywhere away from here." He nodded, reaching over to unlock the door. "Get in! You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice gentle. I climbed in, slamming the door behind me, my hands still trembling. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the forest, the darkness swallowing the road, the trees standing tall and silent. Whatever had been out there, it was still there, watching, waiting, and as the headlights illuminated the road ahead, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me, the tension slowly easing from my shoulders. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The man nodded, giving me a small smile. "You're safe now," he said, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before turning back to the road. "Just rest. We'll get you somewhere safe." I leaned back against the seat, my eyes closing, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb away, leaving me exhausted, every muscle in my body aching. The car rocked gently as it moved, the sound of the tires on the road a comforting rhythm. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back to those woods, not ever. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and I had no intention of ever finding out what it was. The man drove in silence, the forest gradually falling away behind us, replaced by open fields and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light. I kept my eyes closed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed the events over and over, the footprints, the growls, the feeling of being chased. It was as if my brain couldn't quite process it, couldn't make sense of what I had experienced. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice soft. "What were you doing out there, all alone?" I opened my eyes, staring out at the dark fields passing by. "I was hiking," I said, my voice distant. "I do it a lot, but today, something was different." He nodded, not pressing for more details, and I was grateful for that. I didn't have the words to explain it, not really. How do you tell someone that you felt hunted? That there was something in those woods that didn't want you there? We drove for what felt like hours, though it could have been much less. Eventually, the man pulled into a small gas station, the lights buzzing softly in the quiet night. He turned to me, his expression kind. "There's a diner inside," he said. "Get yourself something to eat. I've got to keep going, but they'll help you if you need anything." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I said again, my voice thick with emotion. He smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "Take care of yourself, all right?" I nodded, pushing open the door and stepping out into the cold night air. I watched as his car pulled away, the taillights disappearing down the road, and then I turned, walking towards the diner, the warmth and light spilling out onto the pavement. I still felt that unease, that lingering sense of something watching, something just beyond the edge of sight. But for now, I was safe. For now, I was out of the woods. Story 3. The fire had burned low, leaving just the red glow of embers as the only source of warmth in the darkness. I lay in my tent, half awake, listening to the night sounds of the Appalachian wilderness, the hooting of an owl, the rustling leaves as the wind whispered through the forest. It was supposed to be just me and the stars tonight, nothing but a simple solo camping trip to clear my head. But there was something out there now, something beyond the thin nylon wall of my tent. The noise had been faint at first, barely enough to rouse me. A deep guttural sound vibrating through the silence, something I wasn't accustomed to hearing. I propped myself up on my elbows, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and strained to listen. The sound came again, low and long, and a chill rolled down my spine. It wasn't the kind of sound that belonged here. I reached for my flashlight, hands fumbling slightly in the dark. When I finally found it, I flicked it on, sending a narrow beam of light across the fabric of the tent. My heart pounded in my ears, the kind of deep, echoing thud that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. Slowly, I unzipped the tent door, the noise loud in the otherwise still night. The cool air rushed in, and I leaned forward, pushing the flap aside and shining the light out into the clearing. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of nearby trees and the underbrush that lay scattered at their bases. I scanned slowly, inch by inch, my breath coming in shallow puffs. My campsite looked as it should, deserted, quiet. But something had been there. I could feel it. Suddenly the light caught something, movement, just at the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, my hand steadying the flashlight. There, by the tree line, was a figure, massive and hunched, its eyes reflecting the light like two distant embers. The shape was there only for a moment before it moved, almost gliding back into the darkness. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat as the beam swept over the empty space where it had been. I swallowed hard, every nerve in my body screaming at me to do something, though I wasn't quite sure what. I had never seen anything like that before. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, it was something else. Something bigger, something that moved like it understood I was watching. "Hey!" I called, my voice breaking the fragile quiet. It sounded weak even to my own ears, lost in the immensity of the dark woods. There was no answer, just the wind, brushing softly through the trees, and the crackle of the dying fire. I kept the flashlight trained on the tree line, willing myself to see whatever it was again, but nothing moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I ducked back inside the tent and grabbed the small hatchet I had brought for cutting firewood. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I took another breath, trying to steady my nerves, and stepped out into the clearing. My boots crunched against the fallen leaves, the sound loud in the stillness. I edged toward the fire pit, the embers glowing weakly, and used a stick to stir them back to life, trying to push back the darkness as much as I could. "If there's someone out there," I called, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm armed." The words felt ridiculous as soon as I said them. Armed with what? A hatchet and a flashlight. I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. A vast, unseen presence just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could feel eyes on me, though I saw nothing. Just the dense wall of trees surrounding my little camp. Minutes passed, and slowly the night began to settle again. The wind picked up, carrying with it the soft rustling of leaves, and the owl resumed its hooting somewhere in the distance. I took a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that whatever I'd seen had been just an animal, something curious that had now moved on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I stayed by the fire, feeding it small branches and dry leaves until the flames began to lick up toward the sky again, casting a warm circle of light around me. I sat down on a rock, hatchet resting across my knees, and kept my flashlight beside me. My eyes kept drifting back to the tree line, to the place where I had seen the figure. I could still picture it, the way it had moved, fluid, deliberate, too intelligent. Time dragged on, and eventually, exhaustion began to creep in. I glanced at my watch. It was past 3 in the morning now. The fire had burned down to embers once more, and the adrenaline that had kept me alert was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. I needed sleep, but I knew there was no way I was going back inside that tent, not with the memory of those eyes fresh in my mind. Instead, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and settled as close to the fire as I dared, the hatchet still within arm's reach. I closed my eyes, listening to the crackle of the embers and the sigh of the wind, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that the worst was over, but sleep was elusive, slipping away every time I began to drift off, replaced by the image of that shadowy figure. I kept seeing it in my mind's eye, the way it had stared at me, the glint of its eyes in the flashlight beam. It felt like a warning, a reminder that out here, I was not in control. I was at the mercy of whatever else called these woods home. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees when I finally let myself relax. The sky turned from black to a deep, dusky blue, and the shadows that had seemed so menacing began to lose their power. I sat up, my muscles aching from the cold and the tension of the night. The fire was nothing but ashes now, the last tendrils of smoke curling up into the morning air. Slowly, I stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, to the spot where I had seen the figure. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, but there, pressed into the soft earth, were footprints, huge, much larger than any humans. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt to get a closer look. The prints were deep, the toes splayed, almost like a human's but broader, more powerful. A shiver ran through me, and I stood up, backing away from the tracks. I didn't want to be here anymore. Whatever I had seen last night, it was real. And it was still out here, somewhere. I packed up my camp in record time, my eyes darting constantly to the surrounding forest, half expecting to see that massive figure watching me from the shadows again. The sense of unease didn't leave me until I was back on the trail, heading down the mountain, putting as much distance between myself and that clearing as I could. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sun was fully up, the warmth of the morning beginning to chase away the lingering chill of the night. I paused, looking back up the trail, the trees standing tall and indifferent, the clearing hidden somewhere beyond them. I knew I wouldn't forget that night. Forget. The feeling of being watched, the eyes in the dark, the prints in the earth, they were seared into my memory, a reminder that the world was bigger, stranger than I had ever imagined, and that out there, in the wild places, there were things that defied explanation, things that watched and waited, just beyond the edge of the light. I turned away, heading for my car, the weight of the hatchet still heavy in my hand. Whatever was out there, I hoped I'd never see it again. But deep down, I knew that if I ever did, I would be ready, or at least, I would try to be. Story 4. The sound of branches cracking in the distance had always been part of the job, an owl hunting, a raccoon foraging, the forest simply doing its nightly business. But tonight, the Sierra Nevada was different. The crisp mountain air carried something that felt wrong, like a ripple of tension passing through the quiet woods. I stood at my post, feeling the weight of the darkness all around, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight cutting through the black. "Come on, Mark, it's just another shift," I muttered, shaking my head to dispel the creeping unease. I'd worked as a park ranger for years, and I'd been through countless night vigils. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't ignore the feeling that tonight wasn't like the others. Something was off. It started with the rhythmic thudding, a hollow, deliberate sound echoing through the forest. I paused, tilting my head, trying to gauge the direction. It was subtle at first, like someone striking wood against wood. My initial thought was that it could be other rangers messing around, maybe trying to startle me. But I knew the rest of the team, and I knew they were all at least a few miles away tonight. The thudding came again, louder now, and this time it came from multiple directions. I frowned, narrowing my eyes, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. It felt as though the forest itself was trying to tell me something. I pressed the button on my radio, bringing it to my mouth. "Base, this is Mark. Anyone else out here tonight?" Static answered me. Then a voice crackled through. "Negative. Mark, you're solo. All other units accounted for. You all right out there?" I hesitated. Yeah, I'm good. Just heard something. Could be animals, I guess." My voice didn't sound quite right, even to my own ears. "Copy that. Keep us posted." The radio clicked off, and I felt the silence settle in again, heavier this time. I took a deep breath, adjusting the strap on my flashlight, and started walking, the beam of light bouncing off the underbrush. The night was unnervingly still, no wind, no scurrying animals, just an oppressive quiet. As I moved deeper into the woods, the thudding noise seemed to follow, and I caught glimpses of something shifting between the trees. Shadows danced just beyond my vision, and I found myself tightening my grip on the flashlight. The beam swept across a tree, and I froze. There, on the bark, were fresh scratches, long, deep grooves that cut through the outer layers like they were paper. They were far too high up for any bear or mountain lion, something tall, something strong. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the ridges, feeling the rough splinters. The chill that settled in my bones then had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. I spun around, suddenly very aware of how isolated I was. The weight of the forest pressed in from all sides, each tree an imposing silhouette in the moonless night. A crunch came from behind me, loud and clear. I swung my flashlight around, the light slicing through the shadows. "Who's there?" I called, my voice more forceful this time, though I could feel it waver. The light bounced off tree trunks, their bark mottled with lichen and moss, but there was nothing, no movement, no response. I took a step backward, then another. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to get back to the ranger station, to put some distance between myself and whatever it was that was out there. I knew the forest. I knew its rhythms, its life, its sounds, and tonight the Sierra Nevada was wrong. Another thud, this time closer, almost vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. My pulse quickened, and my breaths turned shallow. I wasn't about to stick around and play games with whatever was out there. I turned and started walking back the way I came, each step deliberate, trying not to make too much noise. The crunching sound came again, this time behind me, heavy footsteps matching my own pace. I didn't dare look back. I focused on the path ahead, my flashlight revealing each uneven rock and root. My radio crackled suddenly, the unexpected noise making me jump. "Mark, you there?" The voice of my supervisor, clear but tinged with static. I fumbled for the radio, my fingers clumsy with fear. "Yeah, I'm here. Something's out here, base. I can't see it, but it's close. Stay calm, Mark. Just make your way back. Keep talking if you need to." His voice was grounding, a connection to something familiar amidst the growing dread. I kept moving, the sounds behind me relentless. Each step I took, there was one to match, a deliberate mirroring that made my skin crawl. And then, as if to break the silence, a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods, a sound so deep I felt it reverberate in my chest. I picked up the pace, almost stumbling as I tried to navigate the uneven ground. My breaths were ragged now, panic bubbling up in my throat. "Base, it's following me!" I hissed into the radio, trying to keep my voice low, as if that might somehow keep me hidden. "Mark, just keep moving." "You're almost to the clearing, right?" "Yeah," I breathed. "Almost there." I could see a faint light ahead, the edge of the woods opening into the clearing near the station. Relief surged through me, my legs moving faster, almost breaking into a run. But then there was a snap, a branch breaking just to my right. My flashlight swung in that direction, the beam catching a glimpse of something. A figure, tall, dark, something that moved impossibly fast, ducking behind a tree before I could truly see it. My heart hammered in my chest, and I turned, running full out now, the underbrush tearing at my legs. I burst into the clearing, stumbling to a halt, my flashlight swinging wildly as I tried to catch my breath. The open space felt like a blessing, the sky above vast and free compared to the claustrophobic confines of the forest. I backed away, towards the small cabin that served as our station, my eyes fixed on the tree line. The crunching stopped. The forest fell silent once more, the oppressive stillness returning, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. My back hit the door of the cabin, and I fumbled for the handle, wrenching it open and slipping inside. I slammed it shut behind me, the lock clicking into place, the thin wooden barrier between me and whatever was out there feeling woefully inadequate. I sank down onto the floor, my back against the door, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The radio crackled to life again. "Mark, did you make it?" "Yeah," I croaked, my throat dry. "I'm in the cabin." There was a pause. Then, "Good. Stay put. We'll send someone your way. First light." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, my eyes still glued to the small window that looked out into the clearing. The moon had risen now, casting long shadows across the ground, the treetops swaying slightly in the night breeze. For a moment, everything seemed calm again, the world as it should be. But I knew better. Somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows of the Sierra Nevada, something was waiting. And as I sat there, the quiet hum of the radio the only sound, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. Story 5. The smell hit me first. A rancid, sharp stench, like ammonia mixed with damp soil. It was enough to make me pause, my boot sinking slightly into the mossy ground of the dense Canadian forest. I knew these woods well, guiding hunters through the rugged terrain for years, but that smell wasn't anything I recognized. It clung to the air, a presence as unmistakable as it was wrong. "Jesus," I muttered, covering my nose with my arm. The hunters, 2 men from the city, quiet types, looked over at me, eyebrows raised. "Something wrong, Gregor?" one of them asked, his voice muffled slightly by the cold air. I shook my head, but my senses were on high alert now, every inch of my skin tingling. "Just a smell," I said, trying to dismiss it. Might be something dead nearby, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. There was something else. We continued through the underbrush, the ground squelching beneath our boots, the occasional snap of a branch breaking the eerie quiet. The forest was dense here, the kind of thick growth that blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving everything bathed in a dim green light. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell, the quiet. It all made my instincts buzz, the ones that kept me safe in the wild. As we moved deeper into the woods, the smell only grew stronger. It wasn't just death. It was something alive, something that stank like it was decaying while it moved. I glanced back at the hunters, who were oblivious, their rifles resting comfortably in their arms. They didn't know the forest like I did. They didn't know that the usual sounds were gone, no rustling of small animals, no bird calls, just silence. I paused again, holding up my hand. "Wait," I said, keeping my voice low. The hunters stopped, exchanging a confused look. "What is it?" the other one asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. I turned my head slowly, listening. There it was, the faint sound of something moving, a soft, almost rhythmic crunch, like something big shifting its weight on the forest floor. It was distant, but not distant enough. I felt the hair on my neck stand on end. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The men frowned, straining their ears. One of them shook his head. "I don't hear anything." I did. I heard it, and I could feel it too, a presence, something that was aware of us, something that didn't belong. I kept my eyes on the tree line, squinting through the maze of trunks and shadows, searching for movement, and then I saw it. Just a flicker, a shadow shifting between the trees, but it was enough. "We need to go," I said, my voice more urgent now. I didn't care about the hunt anymore, didn't care about the expectations these men had for their wilderness adventure. There was something out here with us, something I didn't understand. Now, the hunters hesitated, one of them opening his mouth to argue, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and started back the way we'd come, my pace quick but deliberate. "Hey, what's the rush?" the first man called after me, his voice breaking the eerie quiet. "Just trust me," I shot back, not bothering to turn around. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The crunching behind us grew louder, and I knew it wasn't just us making the noise. I heard the men pick up their pace, the rustle of their clothes and the thud of their boots on the soft ground. I kept my eyes forward, every muscle in my body tensed, my mind calculating the fastest way back to the truck. We were miles from it, but I knew these woods better than anything. I knew how to move, how to avoid the pitfalls, the dense underbrush that would slow us down. The crunching was closer now, a deliberate sound, like something or someone was following us. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the forest. For a split second, I saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, and covered in dark fur. It moved between the trees with a strange kind of grace, almost as if it was gliding. "Move!" I barked, my voice sharp, cutting through the rising panic. The men didn't argue this time. They moved faster, their breathing loud in the silence. I could see the fear on their faces now, the realization that something was wrong, that this wasn't just a leisurely hunt anymore. It was real, and it was coming for us. We broke through a dense patch of undergrowth, the branches clawing at our clothes, and stumbled into a clearing. I paused, breathing heavily, and looked around. The forest closed in on us from all sides, the trees towering, indifferent. The smell was still there, that rotten stench that seemed to cling to everything. "Gregor, what the hell is going on?" one of the men demanded, his eyes wide, his voice edged with panic. I shook my head, my eyes scanning the tree line. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but we need to keep moving." "Is it a bear?" the other one asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, my voice flat. "It's not a bear." For a moment there was silence. Then from the other side of the clearing there was a sound, a deep, guttural growl reverberating through the stillness. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a sound that spoke of something ancient, something that didn't want us here. I took a step back, my eyes locked on the shadows between the trees. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I saw it. The creature, tall, covered in thick, matted fur, its eyes reflecting the dim light. It stood there, watching us, its presence filling the space with a palpable sense of danger. "Go!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Now!" The hunters didn't need to be told again. They turned and ran, their footsteps pounding against the earth. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the creature, my heart hammering in my chest. It watched me, its gaze unblinking, its massive form barely moving, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing between the trees without a sound. I stood there for a moment longer, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. I turned and followed the hunters, my legs shaky, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Whatever it was, it had let us go. But I knew, deep down, that we had been close, too close to something that wasn't meant to be seen. When we finally reached the truck, the men were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They didn't say anything, and neither did I. There was nothing to say. We had seen something, something that defied explanation, something that didn't belong in the neat categories of the natural world. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands still trembling, and started the engine. The forest stretched out behind us, silent and indifferent as I drove away. The tires crunching over the gravel road. Whatever it was still out there, somewhere in the depths of the wilderness. And I knew I'd never forget the way it had looked at me, intelligent, aware, and something else, something that made me feel like I was the intruder. As we left the forest behind, the men finally spoke. their voices hushed, their words disjointed, trying to make sense of what they had seen. But there was no making sense of it. There was only the knowledge that we had been watched, followed, and spared. And that, somehow, was even more unsettling. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the road, my thoughts racing. Whatever was out there, I knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be my last encounter. The forest had secrets, and I had just glimpsed one of them. And part of me, the part that couldn't let go of the unknown, knew I would be back, even if every instinct told me to stay away. Story 6. The night was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to reconnect, to escape the day-to-day grind. Tommy and I had planned everything down to the last detail. We picked a remote spot in Oregon, far from the crowded campgrounds, surrounded by towering pines and clear night skies. It was meant to be perfect, but instead I woke up in the dead of night to something pacing outside our tent. At first I thought it was just my imagination. My senses were half awake, caught in that blurry state between sleep and consciousness. The soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps sounded almost like a metronome. I blinked, my eyes trying to adjust to the darkness as I nudged Tommy. "Tommy," I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm. "Do you hear that?" He groaned softly, still half asleep. "Hear what?" He turned towards me, his face barely visible in the shadows of the tent. But as soon as he focused, his expression changed. He heard it too. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy. They circled the tent slowly, the sound moving through the dry underbrush, crackling against twigs and pine needles. I felt my pulse pick up, the air suddenly feeling thick, suffocating. It wasn't an animal, or if it was bigger than anything I'd heard before. I squeezed Tommy's arm, the fear settling in my stomach like a rock. "What is that?" I whispered. "Probably just a deer," Tommy said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He slowly reached over, fumbling for the flashlight. He found it, clicked it on, and pointed it towards the tent wall. The beam cut through the fabric, lighting up the dim outline of the forest outside. "Nothing. See? It's probably nothing," he said, his voice barely louder than a breath, but the footsteps didn't stop. They paused for a second, then resumed, slower this time, almost as if, whatever it was listening to us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There was a sense of intent to the sound, something methodical about the way it circled us. My heart pounded, and I clenched the sleeping bag around me as if that thin fabric could somehow shield us. "Maybe we should just stay quiet," I suggested. Tommy nodded, his eyes wide, his fingers gripping the flashlight until his knuckles turned white. We sat in silence, the only sound the steady crunch of footsteps circling us, left, then right, closer, then farther, like whatever it was inspecting us, deciding. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The footsteps finally faded away, moving off into the woods. I let out a long, shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Tommy turned off the flashlight, plunging us back into darkness. "See? It's gone," he whispered, but his voice was still tight with tension. I nodded, trying to believe it, trying to convince myself that we were safe. We lay there in the darkness, listening. The forest, once filled with the chirps of crickets and rustling leaves, was now dead silent. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then it did. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the still night, so close it made my skin prickle. Tommy bolted upright, his eyes wide with fear. He fumbled with the flashlight, clicking it on, but the light barely seemed to penetrate the darkness outside the tent. I could see his hand shaking as he held it, the beam dancing erratically. "Ellie, we have to go," he said, his voice cracking. I nodded, my mouth dry, my mind racing. "Okay," I whispered. We moved quickly, trying not to make noise, packing only what we could carry, the essentials. Tommy unzipped the tent slowly, peering out into the night. The growl had stopped, but the silence was even worse. heavy and suffocating. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine. I nodded again, taking a deep breath. We slipped out of the tent, the cold night air biting against my skin, the darkness pressing in from all sides. We moved as quietly as we could, our footsteps muffled against the forest floor. Tommy kept the flashlight low, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. My heart pounded with every step, my ears straining for any sound, any hint that we were being followed. And then I heard it, a branch snapping behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of something tall, a shadow shifting between the trees. I grabbed Tommy's arm, pulling him faster. "Go, go, go," I whispered, my voice trembling. We broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing with each step, the forest blurring around us. I could hear it now, whatever it was, crashing through the underbrush behind us, its footsteps heavy, deliberate. The fear was like ice in my veins, my legs burning as we pushed forward, the path twisting and turning, barely visible in the dim light. "There's the car," Tommy gasped, pointing ahead. I could see the glint of the moonlight on the metal, the outline of the car barely visible through the trees. Relief flooded through me, and we ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We reached the car, and Tommy fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Come on," he muttered, finally getting the door open. We scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut, the locks clicking into place. Tommy started the engine, the headlights flaring to life, illuminating the forest in front of us. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty woods, the trees casting long shadows in the bright light. And then, at the edge of the beam, I saw it. A figure, tall, covered in dark fur, standing just beyond the tree line. It was watching us, its eyes glinting in the light, its breath visible in the cold night air. "Go!" I shouted, my voice breaking. Tommy didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. The car lurched forward, and I kept my eyes on the figure until it disappeared from view, swallowed up by the darkness. We drove in silence, the forest blurring past us, the road winding down the mountain. My hands were still trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. Tommy glanced at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I shook my head, unable to find the words. I didn't know. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I knew was that we had to get as far away from those woods as possible. The road stretched out ahead of us, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. The image of that figure, standing at the edge of the light, was burned into my mind. I knew I'd never forget it, the way it watched us, the way it felt like it was waiting, deciding. Tommy reached over, his hand finding mine, giving it a squeeze. "We're okay now," he said, his voice shaky but trying to be reassuring. I nodded, squeezing his hand back, though the fear still sat heavy in my chest, refusing to let go. We were okay, for now. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't done with us, and as the forest faded into the distance behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only just escaped, that we'd been lucky, this time, and that next time we might not be. Story 7. The first knock came at midnight. 3 deliberate raps that echoed through the stillness of the cabin. My eyes shot open, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I strained to listen, the darkness around me suddenly more oppressive. I had been staying in this remote part of Oregon for 2 nights now, hoping for peace and quiet, a break from the chaos of city life. But there, in the blackness, it felt like something had other plans for me. I lay still, barely breathing, waiting to see if it was just my imagination. But then it came again. Knock, 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 a slow, methodical rhythm that set my teeth on edge. There was no wind tonight, no storm to explain it. I pushed myself upright, my pulse hammering in my ears. The old cabin creaked as I shifted, the floorboards groaning under the weight of history and, perhaps, something else. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I intended, swallowed by the heavy dark. Silence followed, but it wasn't the kind that brought comfort. It was expectant, like something waiting for me to make the next move. I swung my legs off the narrow bed and reached for the flashlight sitting on the small table next to me. The metal felt cool and solid in my hand as I flicked it on, the light piercing through the pitch-black interior of the cabin. Slowly, I made my way across the room, my bare feet brushing against the cold wood, each step echoing in the stillness. The door loomed ahead of me, and I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The knocks had stopped, but that did nothing to ease the gnawing fear settling in my chest. With my free hand, I reached for the door handle, twisting it slowly until the latch clicked. The door creaked open, revealing the emptiness outside. The night was clear, the moonlight casting an eerie silver glow over the clearing in front of the cabin. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the edge of the woods. Trees stood like silent sentinels, shadows shifting between them, but there was no sign of movement. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting into my skin, and tried to convince myself that maybe it had just been an animal. A deer, perhaps, bumping against the side of the cabin. Something normal, something that belonged. "Anyone out here?" I called again, the sound of my voice fading into the vast silence of the woods. Nothing answered. No movement, no noise, just the distant sigh of the wind through the treetops. I turned to head back inside when a noise made me freeze. A soft rustle, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the underbrush to my left. I turned the flashlight in that direction, the beam flickering slightly as I strained to see. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in what looked like dark fur. It was watching me, its eyes reflecting the dim light, glinting like two molten embers. My mouth went dry, and I felt my heart stutter. The air caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only stare as the figure shifted slightly, its massive form blending almost seamlessly with the darkness. It stood there, unmoving, just beyond the line of moonlight that marked the boundary of the clearing. The door behind me creaked as it swung on its hinges, and the noise seemed to jolt me back into my senses. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, my pulse thundering in my ears. The creature, whatever it was, didn't move. It just watched, and there was something in the way it stood that made me think it was waiting, calculating. I backed up until I felt the rough wood of the cabin doorframe against my spine, my hand fumbling for the handle. I couldn't look away from it, couldn't tear my eyes from those burning points of light that seemed to pierce right through me. Finally, my fingers found the door handle, and I yanked it closed, the latch catching with a dull thud. I locked it, my chest heaving as I leaned against the door, the flashlight beam jittering across the cabin's interior. My hands were shaking, the adrenaline coursing through me, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. I wanted to believe it had been a bear, maybe just some trick of the light. But those eyes, there was no mistaking the intelligence in them. I crossed the room quickly, my bare feet silent on the worn wood, and grabbed the old hunting rifle that rested by the window. It was a relic, something the cabin's previous owner had left behind. But I figured it was better than nothing. I checked the chamber, hands trembling, and then moved back to the door, listening. There was nothing, just silence, heavy and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat down on the floor, my back to the door, and rested the rifle across my lap. My eyes darted to the windows, each of them dark, the night outside impenetrable. I could still feel those eyes on me, the weight of that gaze lingering long after the creature had disappeared. Minutes dragged by, stretching into an hour. Then, too, I didn't move, barely breathed, my ears straining for any sound, but the forest remained still, the cabin a fragile bubble of light amidst the darkness. The knocks didn't come again, and neither did the rustle of movement outside. Eventually, exhaustion began to creep in, my body aching from the tension, my head heavy. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, a faint light was filtering through the window. The first grey hints of dawn. I blinked, disoriented, my muscles stiff as I pushed myself upright. The rifle was still across my lap, the metal cold against my skin. I stood slowly, every joint protesting as I moved to the window and peered outside. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. There was no sign of the creature, no tracks in the dirt, no indication that anything had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that whatever had been out there wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I packed my things quickly, my hands still trembling slightly as I shoved my gear into my backpack. I didn't want to stay here any longer, didn't want to find out if the thing from last night would come back. As I stepped out onto the porch, the morning air was crisp, the sky a pale blue overhead. The forest seemed almost peaceful, the terror of the night before fading in the light of day. But as I turned to look back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere, just beyond the edge of sight, those eyes were still there, waiting. I took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of my pack on my shoulder, and started down the path that would lead me back to civilization. Whatever was out there, I hoped it stayed in the shadows. And as I walked away, I knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be my last time in these woods, because no matter how deep the fear ran, there was a part of me that needed to understand. To see those eyes again, to know what it was that had watched me from the dark, and that part of me, the part that couldn't let go, was already planning my return. Story 8. The world looked different through the camera lens, more focused, more vibrant, each moment captured in crisp detail. But that morning, as I crouched in the tall grass at the edge of the forest, something about the scene made my finger hesitate on the shutter. I'd been following a group of deer, their graceful movements serene against the rising sun. And then I noticed it. A figure, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision, something that didn't belong. I lifted my head, peering away from the lens and into the real world, trying to track the movement. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that maybe I was tired from the early hours. But then I saw it again, a large, upright figure disappearing silently into the tree line. I felt a jolt of something in my chest, a mix of curiosity and unease. My camera hung loosely from my neck as I stood up slowly, eyes scanning the woods. "What the?" I muttered under my breath. The deer had scattered, their heads up, eyes wide, disappearing into the brush without a sound. I turned back to the forest, trying to find the movement again. It was early, the morning fog still lingering, and the forest felt thick, almost claustrophobic. A rustling came from my left, and I instinctively raised the camera, focusing in that direction. The zoom adjusted, and I caught a blur, something dark, something massive, moving in a way that didn't match any animal I'd seen out here before. I snapped a shot, the shutter clicking loudly in the quiet morning, and whatever it was, vanished into the shadows. My heart hammered, a mix of excitement and fear. I knew these woods well, every curve and bend, every trail and clearing, but whatever I had just seen was new. I looked at the tiny preview screen on the camera, but the image was blurred, an indistinct dark shape between the trees. I frowned, a chill settling into my bones that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "All right, Javier, don't lose it," I told myself, though the words didn't feel convincing. I took a deep breath and checked my watch. 7:23 a.m. The day was still young, and the sun barely pierced through the thick canopy, its rays like spears of gold filtering down to the forest floor. I could either go back to the cabin and shrug this off, or I could follow. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, I'd hear the chatter of birds, the distant rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, but now it was just silence, a deep, pressing silence that seemed to follow me as I moved deeper into the woods. Each step felt deliberate, the crunch of leaves under my boots too loud. I paused every few minutes, listening, scanning, waiting for that shadow, that shape to appear again. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time felt strange out here, like it was being stretched and compressed all at once. I came to a small clearing, a spot I knew well, where the light broke through and painted the ground in patches of warm yellow. I looked around, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The silence was still there, hanging like a blanket over the woods, when suddenly I heard it, the distinct crack of a branch breaking, deliberate, heavy. I swung my camera around, raising it instinctively, the lens focusing as I scanned the tree line. There it was, a figure, tall, almost unnaturally so, standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. My breath caught, my finger hovering over the shutter, afraid that the sound might make it disappear again. "Hey!" I called, the words slipping out before I could stop it. The figure moved slowly, stepping further into the shadows. I snapped a photo, the shutter clicking, and this time it didn't vanish, it turned. I could barely make out its face, but what I saw made my skin prickle. Deep-set eyes, staring right at me, unblinking. Another snap, another photo. But the movement was too quick. The figure twisted and disappeared, leaving me standing there, camera in hand, heart pounding. The sense of unease that had been nagging at me all morning exploded into full-blown fear. Whatever that was, it was aware of me. It wasn't some fleeting animal, it wasn't a trick of the light. It was real, and it was watching. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the spot where it had vanished. The forest, still silent, seemed to close in around me, the trees feeling more like barriers than cover. My pulse thrummed in my ears, and I stumbled slightly, the camera swaying from my neck. "All right, time to go," I muttered, trying to sound braver than I felt. I turned and started moving, my steps faster now, more deliberate, no longer caring about the noise I made. I needed to get out of there, to put distance between myself and whatever I had just seen. I glanced down at the camera again, my thumb swiping through the images. Blurred shapes, dark figures, nothing concrete, nothing that anyone would look at and say, "Yes, that's something." The further I got from the clearing, the more the tension in my chest eased, but it never completely left. It wasn't until I could see the glint of my car, parked just off the dirt road, that I let myself breathe again. I glanced back at the woods, the treetops swaying gently in the breeze, looking peaceful, almost inviting, a stark contrast to how they had felt just minutes before. I opened the car door, sliding into the seat and locking the doors almost out of instinct. My hands were trembling slightly, and I let out a long breath, resting my head against the steering wheel for a moment. What the hell had I just seen? I'd heard the stories, of course. People always talked about strange sightings in the woods, especially out here, in the deep forests where few dared to venture. But I had never put much stock in them. Until now. The camera felt heavy around my neck, and I lifted it again, staring at the tiny screen. The last photo, the one where it had looked right at me, made my skin crawl. It was still blurry, but there was no mistaking the outline of a face, those eyes. My gut twisted, a mixture of fear and an unsettling curiosity. I wanted answers, but at the same time, I knew I might not like what I found. I started the engine, the car rumbling to life, the sound almost comforting after the oppressive silence of the woods. As I pulled away, the road winding away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere, hidden in the shadows of those trees, something was still there, still watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last time I'd come looking for it, whatever it was. The drive back to the cabin was a blur, my mind replaying the morning over and over. The figure, the way it moved, the way it had looked at me, it was burned into my memory, vivid and unrelenting. I parked in front of the cabin, the structure small and rustic, a place that had always felt like a retreat, a safe haven. But as I stepped out of the car, the forest loomed around it, and for the first time, it didn't feel quite so safe. Inside, I set the camera on the table, pacing the small living room, my thoughts racing. Should I tell someone? Would anyone even believe me? I could already hear the skepticism in their voices, the dismissive chuckles. "Oh, Javier, you've been out there too long. You're seeing things." But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't just in my head. I paused, staring at the camera, the images still there, proof, though not enough to convince anyone but myself. The sun was higher now, the light streaming through the windows, warming the room, but the chill in my bones remained. I sat down, grabbing a notepad, and began to write. Everything I could remember, every detail, every sound, every movement. Maybe it was just for me, maybe it was for someone else, but I needed to get it down, to make it real, to convince myself that I hadn't imagined it. The hours ticked by, the day slipping away as I wrote, my eyes drifting back to the window every few minutes, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching. But the woods remained still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the world outside seemingly calm. When I finally put the pen down, my hand was cramped, my head aching, but there was a strange sense of relief. I had faced it, if only on paper. I picked up the camera one last time, scrolling through the images again. The blurry figure, the dark outline, those eyes, they stared back at me, challenging me, daring me to return, and I knew I would. Whatever was out there, I couldn't leave it alone. Not now. Not after today. I glanced out the window, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The fear was still there, deep and gnawing, but beneath it something else stirred, a determination, a need to understand, to see it again, to capture it, not just in a blurred photograph, but truly see it. And as the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky, I knew this was far from over. Story 9. The river was silent, a kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had been paused. I stood there, the rod hanging limp in my hand, the usual chatter of birds and rustle of leaves absent. It was only me and the soft current lapping at the banks. The sense of being alone, really alone, crept in slowly, chilling my spine. And that's when I felt it, that peculiar sense of being watched. I turned my head slightly, scanning the opposite bank. It was covered in shadow, thick with trees and undergrowth, the kind of terrain that was impossible to see through. But there, among the shadows, I could swear I saw movement, a large shape, just standing. I blinked and squinted against the fading light, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Nah," I muttered to myself, shaking my head and looking away. "Just your mind playing tricks, Carlos." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I forced my gaze back across the water, heart pounding harder than I cared to admit, and there it was again, this time clearer, a dark, upright figure, larger than any animal I knew of around here. It seemed to sway slightly, as if it were shifting its weight from one foot to another. My hand tightened around the rod, the line dipping low into the water, and I swallowed hard. My instinct screamed for me to look away, to act like I hadn't noticed, but curiosity rooted me in place. For a moment, it felt like the river had frozen between us, the soft ripples pausing, the whole world holding its breath. I stared across the water, and I could see now that it wasn't just an animal. It was watching me, too. My mind flashed through the possibilities. A bear, maybe a person. But the size, it was impossibly tall. And those shoulders, broad as hell, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. I backed up a step, the pebbles underfoot crunching loudly in the silence, and the figure flinched, the movement fluid but quick, like it was startled. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to steady my hands, my eyes still glued to the thing on the other bank. I could feel every inch of my body tensed, as though waiting for something. Some sign that I needed to run. Okay, easy. I whispered, more to myself than anything. I kept backing away, slow and deliberate, the fishing rod dangling at my side now, completely forgotten. The figure remained still, but I could feel the intensity of its gaze, like it was studying me, trying to decide what to do next. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, almost falling. The rod clattered against the rocks, and I cursed under my breath, steadying myself. The noise seemed to break whatever trance had settled over the river. I glanced back up, and the figure moved, not away but closer, stepping out from the shadows, its full form illuminated by the fading evening light. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be built entirely of muscle, covered in thick fur. The eyes glinted, reflecting the dim light, and I saw something in them. Intelligence, curiosity, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that didn't fit neatly into any box I knew. Jesus, I muttered, not even realizing I'd said it aloud. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it, every beat echoing through my head. I took another step back, then another, the riverbank sloping upward behind me, my body aching with tension. I didn't turn my back on it, couldn't bring myself to look away, and that's when it made a noise, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in its chest, almost like a growl but more measured, like it was warning me. My hands went cold, and I took another step, my eyes fixed on its massive frame, watching the way it swayed slightly, those glowing eyes never leaving mine. It didn't follow me when I finally turned, when I finally forced myself to put one foot in front of the other and climb the hill away from the river. I glanced back only once, just before the trees swallowed the view, and I saw it still standing there, watching me leave. It hadn't moved, but it was still watching. I could feel it even after the trees obscured the view. My legs carried me faster than I intended, my breath coming in short bursts, the cold air burning in my lungs. My campsite wasn't far, just a short walk from the river, but every crunch of the leaves under my boots felt amplified, like a beacon announcing my location. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it following, but the forest was empty. Still, the sense of being watched clung to me, a constant presence just beyond sight. When I finally reached my tent, I dropped the fishing rod, hands trembling as I fumbled with the zipper, the metallic clink echoing in the quiet. I crawled inside, zipping it shut behind me, the thin nylon feeling like a fragile barrier against whatever was out there. My chest heaved, and I leaned back, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The growl, the eyes, the sheer size of it. There was no way that was just a bear. I knew these woods. I'd been coming out here for years, and I'd never seen anything like that. I grabbed my pack, rummaging through it until I found my flashlight, the beam flickering slightly as I clicked it on. I shone it around the inside of the tent, the light bouncing off the fabric, a desperate attempt to reassure myself. I wanted to believe that I was safe, that whatever was out there was gone now, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It had seen me, it had watched me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had let me go, that whatever it was, it could have done something if it had wanted to. The thought made my stomach twist, fear settling in my gut like a heavy stone. I stayed awake, listening, every little creak of the forest outside sending a fresh wave of dread through me. I could still see those eyes, the way they'd reflected the light, the way they'd followed me. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to filter through the fabric of the tent that I finally let myself relax, the tension slowly ebbing away as the darkness retreated. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the forest seemed almost normal again. The birds had returned, their songs filling the air, the morning light casting long shadows across the ground. But the river, I didn't look in that direction. I couldn't bring myself to. I packed up camp quickly, my hands still shaking as I stuffed my gear into my bag, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. I needed to leave. needed to get out of these woods and back to somewhere that made sense, somewhere where the world felt predictable again. As I slung my pack over my shoulder and started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere, hidden in the depths of the forest, those eyes were still following my every move. And even as I walked away, as the forest closed in around me, I knew that this wouldn't be the end, because there was a part of me buried beneath the fear that wanted to understand, to see it again, to know what it was that had stood there, watching me from the shadows, and that part of me, no matter how small, was already planning the next trip. Story 10. The air had a strange edge to it that day, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up for no good reason. I was leading an eco-tour group through the thick forests of Washington, a place I had traversed 100 times, my element. The trail twisted through a canopy of ancient trees, and usually their towering presence felt like guardians. But today they seemed to be holding their breath, waiting. It was just a few of us. 2 retired teachers from Vermont, a photographer from Seattle, and a father-daughter pair who kept to themselves. I walked at the front, my eyes scanning the dense green ahead, ears tuned to the familiar chorus of bird calls and rustling leaves. It should have been peaceful, but something was off. It started with the smell, a pungent odor that hit us all at once, so strong that a few in the group actually gagged. "God, what is that?" Jim, one of the teachers, exclaimed, covering his nose with his hand. His wife, Margie, wrinkled her face, stepping closer to him. "Probably a dead animal," I said, though the words came out uncertain. I knew what a decomposing animal smelled like. This was different, almost like wet fur mixed with something rotten. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual rustling dying down until only the wind in the treetops could be heard. "Whatever it is, let's keep moving," I added, urging the group forward. My voice held a calm that I didn't quite feel, my gaze flickering between the underbrush and the people I was guiding. The photographer, a wiry guy named Mike, seemed unfazed, raising his camera and snapping shots of the trees. "Maybe we'll see some scavengers," he mused, and I forced a smile. "Maybe," I said, but deep down, I wasn't hoping for any scavengers. I was hoping we'd find nothing at all. We kept walking, but that smell lingered, drifting in and out as we moved along the trail. I found myself glancing back more often than usual, each time catching the nervous expressions of my group. Even Mike had lowered his camera, his casual demeanor replaced by a wary curiosity. It was when we reached the small clearing that things got stranger. The clearing was supposed to be a rest stop, a place where we could sit, have some water, let the group take in the beauty of the forest. But the second we stepped into that space, I knew something was wrong. The ground was torn up, branches lay scattered, as if something had come through with deliberate force, not the randomness of a storm. In the center, a young tree had been snapped in half, its trunk splintered, the jagged edges pointing skyward. "Whoa! What happened here?" the father of the father-daughter pair muttered. His daughter, who couldn't have been older than 15, looked around with wide eyes, clutching his arm. I stepped forward, my boots crunching over broken twigs. "Maybe a bear," I said, but the words felt hollow. Bears didn't do this. Not like this. Not so focused, almost angry. Mike raised his camera again, but I noticed his hands weren't quite steady. He snapped a picture, the shutter sound startling in the eerie silence. I walked over to the broken tree, touching the splintered wood. It was fresh, the sap still sticky on my fingers. "Carla!" Margie called, her voice barely above a whisper. Should we turn back?" I looked at her, then at the others. Fear was beginning to settle into their eyes, and I felt it too, a gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. I forced a smile. "Let's take a quick break, and then we'll head back," I said, trying to keep my voice light. The group nodded, though they stayed clustered close together, their eyes darting to the edge of the clearing. I took a deep breath, walking to the other side, my eyes scanning the forest. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, an almost tangible weight pressing against my skin. And then I heard it. A low, mournful howl, echoing through the trees, far off but unmistakable. The kind of sound that doesn't belong, that makes your instincts flare, telling you that something is very wrong. The group froze, their eyes wide, and I turned back to them, trying to stay calm. "It's just maybe a coyote," I said, though the words felt empty. I'd heard coyotes before. This was different, deeper, almost like a voice more than an animal call. Jim shook his head, his face pale. "That didn't sound like any coyote I've ever heard," he said. Mike lowered his camera, his eyes meeting mine. "You've been out here a lot, right? You've heard that before?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No," I admitted, "not like that." Another howl echoed, closer this time, and I saw the fear flare in their eyes. The father pulled his daughter closer, and I knew then that we had to leave, now. "All right, we're heading back," I said, my voice firmer, louder. "Stay close, keep together." We moved quickly, retracing our steps, the forest closing in around us. My heart pounded in my chest, my ears straining for any sound, any hint that something was following. The silence was broken only by the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch, each one making me jump. The smell returned, stronger now, clinging to the air like a warning. I glanced back and my breath caught. There, between the trees, I saw movement, a shadow, tall, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My pulse spiked, and I turned back to the group. "Keep moving," I urged, my voice shaking now. The fear I'd been trying to keep at bay was clawing its way up, each step feeling like it took us deeper into danger rather than away from it. "Carla, what is it?" Margie asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. The figure, the shadow I'd seen. It was no animal, no bear, no coyote. It was something else, something that didn't belong here, something that seemed to be pushing us, herding us. Another howl, this one so close it made my skin prickle. The group broke into a jog, fear driving them forward, and I stayed at the back, my eyes scanning the woods, my heart pounding. We had to make it back. We had to get out of these woods. The trees blurred past, and finally, I saw it. The edge of the forest, the trailhead, the parking lot just beyond. Relief flooded through me, and I pushed the group forward, urging them on. We stumbled out of the woods, breathless, our faces pale, the oppressive weight of the forest finally lifting. We stood there, panting, looking back at the trees. The forest loomed, dark and silent, the treetops swaying gently in the wind. Whatever had been out there, it was still there, hidden in the shadows, watching. Jim turned to me, his face still pale. "What the hell was that, Carla?" I shook my head, swallowing hard. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper, and it was the truth. I didn't know what we had just experienced, what had been following us, herding us. All I knew was that it wasn't over, that whatever it was still out there, waiting. The group slowly dispersed, getting into their cars, their faces still etched with fear. I stood there for a moment longer, staring into the woods. The feeling of being watched, never quite leaving me. The forest, once my refuge, now felt like a stranger, something dark, something that held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. I turned away, walking to my car, my hands still trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I needed answers, but I knew I wouldn't find them today, not here, not now. As I drove away, the forest receded in the rearview mirror, the shadows swallowing it whole, and deep down, I knew I'd be back. I had to be. Story 11. The trail was supposed to be quiet, a simple afternoon walk in the remote corners of Tahoe with my dog, Duke, leading the way. The air was crisp, the forest thick and comforting, Everything you'd want for a peaceful retreat from the bustle of the city. Duke trotted ahead, his tail a happy blur, his nose sniffing at the base of trees and patches of dirt. But then he stopped, ears pricking up, his body stiffening in a way that immediately put me on edge. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice low, following his gaze towards the thick mass of trees to our left. Duke let out a low growl, a sound I'd never heard him make before. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something that made my stomach clench. His tail was between his legs, his body rigid, a low rumble still vibrating through him. I peered into the forest, squinting through the shadows. My eyes scanned the underbrush, searching for any sign of movement, a deer, maybe another hiker. But there was nothing. Just the silent, endless stretch of pines, the kind of silence that gnawed at you, that made the hairs on your arms stand up. "Come on, Duke," I urged, tugging lightly on his leash. But he resisted, his eyes still locked on whatever was hidden in the trees. The growl got louder, almost a snarl now, and my heart began to pound against my ribs. Something wasn't right. "Duke, let's go," I said again, this time more forceful, my voice cracking just a little. I didn't like this. I didn't like the way the forest seemed to close in around us, like it was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a crack, the unmistakable snap of a branch underfoot. My head whipped around, and I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, a flash of something dark, something large. My breath caught in my throat, and Duke let out a bark, the sound echoing off the trunks and disappearing into the vast silence. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady, though I wasn't sure if I wanted an answer. There was no response, just the faint rustle of leaves, as if something had moved away, retreating deeper into the forest. I swallowed hard, my grip on Duke's leash tightening. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to get out of there. But part of me, that stupid, curious part that never seemed to know when to quit, made me take a step closer to the tree line. Duke whined, pulling back, his ears pinned flat against his head. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or me. I took another step, my eyes straining against the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, standing between the trees. Its body was covered in dark fur, almost blending in with the trunks around it, but its eyes, those eyes caught the light, reflecting back at me, glowing faintly in the dimness. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. This wasn't a bear, this wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Duke barked again, louder this time, his body trembling against my leg. The figure moved, shifting slightly, its gaze never leaving mine. It wasn't advancing, wasn't retreating. It was just watching, calculating, and that terrified me more than if it had charged at us. "Okay, we're going," I muttered, more to myself than anything, my voice barely a whisper. I took a step back, then another, my eyes locked on the creature, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on it. Not yet. Slowly, I backed away, pulling Duke with me, his growls now turning into whimpers. The figure remained where it was, its glowing eyes following our every movement. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, my heart lurching in my chest. I somehow kept my balance, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We moved down the trail, inch by inch, until the creature finally disappeared from view, swallowed by the thick shadows of the forest. Only then did I turn, my legs shaking as I broke into a run, Duke right beside me. The trees blurred around us, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit, but there was nothing, only the rush of my own breath, the pounding of my feet on the earth. When we finally reached the trailhead, I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath, my chest burning. Duke pressed against my side, still whining softly, his eyes darting back towards the woods. I looked back too, half expecting to see that massive figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. But the forest was empty, peaceful, deceptively so. I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I reached down to scratch behind Duke's ears, trying to calm both of us. "We're okay, boy," I whispered, though the words felt hollow, because I knew what I'd seen. I knew that whatever was out there hadn't been just an animal. It had been something else, something that watched and understood. I stood up, my legs still unsteady, and started towards my car, Duke sticking close to my side. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that somewhere hidden in the depths of the forest, those glowing eyes were still on us. As I opened the car door and Duke jumped in, I took one last look at the trailhead, at the dark line of trees beyond. A chill ran through me, and I knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be my last encounter, because no matter how much fear had gripped me in those moments, there was a part of me that needed to know, needed to understand what was out there. And as I drove away, the forest fading into the distance behind me, I knew that one day I'd be back. Duke whined softly from the passenger seat, and I reached over, my fingers brushing his fur. "Yeah, I know, buddy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Next time, we'll be ready." Story 12. The morning started like any other. The steady rhythm of my axe against the trunk, the scent of pine sap, and the distant call of a jay somewhere deeper in the forest. It was just another day in the heart of the British Columbian wilderness. The world felt vast but familiar, like an old friend. But then, everything seemed to change in an instant. I swung my axe, splitting another section of the tree with a satisfying crack, when something made me stop. The kind of instinct that halts you before you even understand why. I straightened, my hand resting on the handle, and listened. Silence, the kind that wraps around you, thick and oppressive. No birds, no wind, just nothing. "What the hell?" I muttered, looking around. The forest was never quiet. Even in the winter there was always something. A scuffle, a whistle, a distant rustle. But now it was as if every living thing had decided to hold its breath. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, the feeling of unease crawling along my spine like a cold finger. Maybe it was just my imagination. I tried to shake it off, bending down to grab another log, but the feeling didn't leave. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees that rose like tall, silent giants around me. Then I heard it, a deep, resonant thud like something heavy had hit the ground, followed by a low, almost guttural noise. My chest tightened, the axe suddenly feeling much heavier in my hand. I turned slowly, my eyes narrowing, trying to locate the source of the sound. It had come from deeper in the forest, somewhere in the direction where the trees grew denser, more tangled. "Could be an animal," I whispered to myself. But my voice didn't sound convincing, even to my own ears. I knew these woods. I'd been working here for years, cutting, hauling, always surrounded by nature. And whatever that noise was, it wasn't something I recognized. Another thud echoed through the woods, closer this time. My heartbeat picked up, and without even thinking, I stepped backward, my boots crunching over the underbrush. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get the hell out of there, but at the same time, a part of me, the part that was just as stubborn as I was, needed to know what it was. I took a deep breath, adjusting my grip on the axe, and started moving towards the noise. The forest swallowed me up almost immediately, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the sunlight, leaving only dappled patches of light scattered across the ground. My footsteps were careful, each one deliberate, as I made my way deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder, and that uneasy silence pressed in on me from all sides. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my senses on high alert. The ground underfoot was soft, almost damp, and I stepped around a fallen tree, the bark covered in thick, green moss. Another thud. This time I could swear it was almost right in front of me, beyond the thick wall of ferns. I hesitated, then pushed forward, brushing the ferns aside with the axe handle. And there, just beyond the thick foliage, I saw it. Something large, a hulking shape moving slowly between the trees. My breath caught, my fingers tightening around the axe handle until my knuckles turned white. The figure was covered in dark hair, its back to me. Its movements deliberate, almost methodical. It was massive, easily twice my height, its shoulders broad, muscles rippling beneath the thick fur. It paused, and I could hear it breathing, a low, deep sound that seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath my feet. My mouth went dry. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in these parts had. The rumors, the tales told over a campfire, about something that lived deep in the forests, something that wasn't quite an animal, wasn't quite a man. But I'd always laughed it off, dismissing it as just another legend meant to scare the new guys. Yet here I was, staring at something that shouldn't exist, something that made every muscle in my body scream to run. But I couldn't move. I could only watch as it turned, its head shifting slightly, the hint of a face just visible in the dappled light. Its eyes met mine, dark, intelligent and unblinking. For a moment we were locked there, neither of us moving, neither of us breathing. A snap of a twig broke the silence, and I flinched, my heart slamming against my ribcage. The creature turned fully now, its body twisting towards me, and I saw its face clearly, a mix of ape and human, the brow heavy, the mouth set in a line. It studied me, as if trying to decide what to do. I took a step back, my boot catching on a root, and I stumbled, the axe slipping from my grasp and hitting the ground with a dull thud. The creature flinched, its head snapping to the side, and in that moment, something shifted. It turned, moving away, its massive form disappearing into the trees with an almost ghostly silence, leaving me there, alone. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the axe, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The forest seemed to exhale, the sounds of nature slowly coming back, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But the air was still thick with that sense of something unseen, something that had been there and could come back. I didn't waste any more time. I turned and made my way back the way I'd come. My steps hurried, each one taking me farther from whatever the hell I had just seen. My breath came in short gasps, my eyes scanning the trees, expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking behind every trunk. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd been working, I let out a shaky breath, the tension in my chest easing just a fraction. I leaned against the stump of the tree I'd been cutting, my hands trembling. I glanced around, half expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. But there was nothing, just the trees, tall and silent, and the distant sounds of the forest slowly coming back to life. I grabbed my things, throwing them into the back of my truck with shaky hands. I needed to get out of there, to put distance between me and whatever was lurking in those woods. I started the engine, the sound roaring to life, and I took one last look at the tree line, the shadows deepening as the sun moved overhead. I knew I wouldn't be telling anyone about this. Not because they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't seen it, but because I wasn't ready to admit what I had seen, wasn't ready to confront the idea that there was something out there, something real, something that wasn't just a story. As I drove away, the forest slowly disappeared in my rearview mirror, replaced by the winding road and the distant peaks of the mountains. But the image stayed with me, that dark figure, those eyes watching me, the silence that had swallowed the forest whole, and deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last time I'd come face to face with whatever it was. The forest held its secrets close, and now I was part of that secret too. Story 13. The call of something primal, echoing through the valley, caught me off guard. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't any animal I knew of. It was a deep, resonating howl, vibrating in my chest, and it stirred an ancient fear in me that I hadn't felt in years, not since I'd first learned what true wilderness felt like. I'd been hunting in the Swedish wilderness for a few days, taking clients through the dense forest, pointing out elk and occasionally an Arctic hare or two. It was all routine, a job I'd done for years, nothing I hadn't seen before. But that call, that howl, was different. I knew it immediately. One of the hunters, a young guy from Stockholm, all bravado and brand new boots, turned towards me, his face a mix of confusion and bravado. What was that? Gunner? A wolf? His smile was nervous, his hands clutching his rifle a little tighter than before. I shook my head slowly, my eyes scanning the thick line of trees that stretched out before us. The forest was silent now, a heavy kind of silence that swallowed the usual rustle of leaves and far-off calls of birds. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "No," I said, my voice low. "That wasn't a wolf." The young hunter laughed, but it was forced, the kind of laugh that tried to hide the edge of fear. "What then? You telling me we've got ghosts out here?" I ignored him, my gut telling me that whatever had made that sound was still out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest. I nodded towards the others, a signal to keep moving, to stay quiet. The fewer questions, the better. We made our way through the underbrush, the crunch of snow and leaves beneath our boots, the only noise breaking the uneasy silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere, out beyond the reach of our sight, something was following us. It was an instinct I'd learned to trust, the kind of sixth sense that came from years in the wilderness, from understanding how the forest spoke to those who listened. A few minutes later, we reached a small clearing, and I held up my hand, motioning for the group to stop. The air was heavy, almost too quiet. My eyes scanned the snow-covered ground, and that's when I saw them. Tracks, big, deep impressions, too large to be from a bear, and they didn't belong to anything else I could think of. "What the hell is that?" One of the older men in the group muttered, crouching down beside me to look at the prints, his brow furrowed, his fingers hovering over the edge of the massive footprint. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The tracks were fresh, the edges sharp against the snow, and they led away from the clearing towards the darker, denser part of the forest, the place where the trees grew close together, their branches heavy with shadows. "Could be a hoax," the younger hunter said, though there was a waver in his voice now. "Some prank, right? Kids messing around." I shook my head again, my eyes still on the tracks. They were deep, far too deep for anything made as a joke, and there was something about them, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Whatever it is, it's still close," I said, straightening up, my eyes drifting to the tree line. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on us, the quiet almost oppressive now, the cold seeping through my thick coat. The others shifted uneasily, their rifles suddenly feeling less reassuring, more like toys. And then, from somewhere beyond the clearing, came another sound, a low, guttural rumble echoing through the trees, freezing us all in place. It wasn't like the howl before. It was closer, more deliberate, almost like a warning. My heart pounded, the instinct to run warring with my years of training, the knowledge that turning your back on a predator was the quickest way to become prey. "We're moving," I said, my voice tight. "Slow and steady, stay quiet. Keep your eyes open." No one argued. We began to back away, moving in the direction we'd come, our eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every dark shape between the trees a potential threat. My fingers gripped my rifle tighter, my senses heightened, each crunch of snow beneath my boots sounding deafening in the silence. As we moved, I glanced over my shoulder, catching a flicker of movement just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there, a massive shape, moving with a kind of grace that seemed out of place for something so large. I forced myself to keep walking, each step feeling like it took an eternity, the weight of that unseen gaze pressing on my back. The young hunter, his breath coming in short, shaky bursts, glanced at me, his eyes wide. "Gunner, what do you think it is? What's out there?" I didn't answer right away. What could I say that I didn't know? That whatever it wasn't something I wanted to confront here, miles from anywhere, with the sun sinking lower and the shadows stretching longer. "Something we don't want to meet," I said finally, my voice grim. "Just keep moving." The others nodded, their faces pale, and we continued on, the forest feeling more like a maze of uncertainty with each passing moment. It was only when we broke through to a wider trail, one that led back towards camp, that I felt some of the tension begin to ease. But even then, I kept my eyes on the forest behind us, waiting for another glimpse of that shadow, for the flicker of movement that meant it was still following. It wasn't until we reached camp, the tents and the trucks a sight that brought with it a rush of relief, that I finally let myself breathe. The others were talking in low voices, their hands still shaking as they set down their rifles, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade. I moved to the edge of the camp, my eyes on the dark line of trees beyond, the forest now bathed in the blue-grey light of early evening. I didn't know what I'd seen, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't the last time I'd be in these woods, wasn't the last time I'd feel that presence, that sense of something watching, calculating, waiting just beyond the edge of sight. One of the hunters approached me, his face drawn, his eyes darting nervously towards the forest. "Gunner," he said, his voice low, "you think it's gone?" I glanced at the trees, at the shadows that seemed to deepen with each passing moment, and shook my head slowly. "I think it's out there," I said, "but it's not coming closer. Not tonight." He nodded, though the fear in his eyes didn't fade. "We'll leave at first light." "Yeah," I said, "first light." As night fell, I stayed by the fire, the rifle resting across my lap, my eyes on the darkened woods. The others tried to sleep, their uneasy murmurs fading into silence, but I knew I wouldn't rest, not with that thing still out there, somewhere, watching us. The wilderness had secrets, and I'd just glimpsed one of them, and no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I knew I'd be back, drawn by the mystery, by the need to understand what was out there, hidden in the shadows. Because that was the nature of the wild. It pulled you in, even when you knew better. It made you want to see, to know. And one day, I knew I'd come face to face with it again. Whatever it was that haunted the deep places of the forest, whatever it was that watched us with eyes that held more understanding than any animal should. Until then, I'd keep listening, and I'd keep my rifle close. Story 14. It's funny how running had always been my escape, a way to leave behind the stress, the noise, the weight of it all. The North Cascades were perfect for that, offering long, winding trails that twisted through endless green, with nothing but the sound of my feet and the rustling leaves. But on that particular morning, something felt different. The forest was too quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath, and I could feel the tension pressing down on me as I moved. I wasn't new to the trails. I'd been running them for years, had memorized every bend, every steep incline, every place where the trail widened and gave way to spectacular views. But as I rounded a corner that morning, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, a chill that had nothing to do with the cool dawn air. My pace slowed. I listened, the soft rhythm of my breathing and my footfalls the only sounds I could hear. There was no wind rustling through the branches, no chirping of birds welcoming the morning. I glanced around, scanning the underbrush for any movement, my pulse quickening. And then I heard it, the sharp crack of a branch breaking, somewhere off to the side of the trail. I stopped completely, my eyes narrowing as I tried to pinpoint the sound. It hadn't been far off. Maybe 20-30 feet. My breath misted in the cold air as I waited, my heart thumping harder. Whatever had made the noise wasn't moving now, and the silence felt thick, almost oppressive. "Probably just a deer," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. even to my ears. I took a few steps forward, but the feeling lingered, the sense that I wasn't alone, that eyes were on me from somewhere beyond the trees. The trail dipped, winding down into a shallow valley, and I tried to focus on my breathing, on the rhythm of my stride. I just needed to keep moving, to let the run work its magic and clear my head. But the unease stayed, gnawing at me, and I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. It was when I reached a narrow wooden footbridge, the kind that creaked underfoot, that I saw it. Movement. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure, dark and tall, slipping between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself against the wooden railing. I turned, my eyes scanning the forest. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing faintly through the stillness. No answer. The figure was gone, if it had even been there at all. I blinked, squinting into the shadows, but there was nothing, just the endless green, the thick trunks of the pines standing tall and silent. My gut twisted. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, the morning shadows playing games with my mind. But the feeling wouldn't leave. That feeling of being watched, of something just beyond sight, keeping pace with me. I pushed away from the railing, my legs feeling unsteady. I couldn't stay here. I started running again, my feet pounding against the wooden boards of the bridge before hitting the dirt trail once more. My breath came faster, my stride longer, as if I could outrun the unease, leave it behind somewhere on the winding trail. But the sound came again, a soft rustle, then the unmistakable snap of a twig. I whipped my head around, and for just a split second I saw it, a face, half hidden behind a tree, watching me. My blood ran cold, fear seizing my chest like a vice. It wasn't an animal, not a deer, not anything I could explain away. "No, no, no," I whispered, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. I turned back to the trail, my feet moving before I even made the conscious decision to run. This time, I wasn't running for the peace of it. I was running to get away, to escape whatever was hiding in those woods. The forest blurred around me, the branches seeming to close in, the path twisting and turning, each bend feeling like it might reveal something waiting. My breaths came fast and shallow, panic rising in my throat. I had to get out. I needed to get back to the parking lot, to where there were people, safety. The trail forked, and I veered left, my legs burning with the effort. I could still feel it, the presence, the eyes, the sense that something was there, following me, just out of sight. The shadows seemed deeper now, the trees taller, more imposing, as if the forest itself was shifting, changing to keep me in. And then, up ahead, I saw it, the trailhead, the clearing that led out of the woods. Relief surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my lungs screaming for air. I broke through the tree line, stumbling into the open space, the sight of parked cars like a beacon of hope. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath, my whole body trembling. I looked back at the trail, the shadows dark and impenetrable, and for a moment I thought I saw it again, the figure, standing just beyond the trees, watching. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I straightened, my breath slowly evening out, my heart still racing. I needed to leave. I walked quickly towards my car, my eyes darting back to the woods every few steps, expecting to see something step out from the shadows, to see those eyes again, unblinking, watching. I fumbled with my keys, finally unlocking the car and slipping inside. I locked the doors, my hands still shaking as I started the engine. The car rumbled to life, the sound grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. I glanced at the trailhead one last time, my eyes scanning the line of trees. But there was nothing, just the empty forest, silent and still. I pulled out of the parking lot, the tires crunching over the gravel, and as I drove away, the tension slowly began to ease from my shoulders. But the unease didn't leave me completely. I could still see it in my mind, that face, those eyes, watching me from the shadows. The forest had always been my refuge, my escape. But now, it felt different. It felt like something else was out there, something that didn't want me there, something that had let me go this time, but maybe wouldn't the next. I took a deep breath, my eyes on the road ahead, the mountains rising in the distance. I wasn't sure if I'd come back, if I'd be able to run these trails again without feeling that fear, that presence. But I knew one thing, whatever it was still out there, and it was watching. And maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for me to return. Story 15. The sound of something large moving outside the tent snapped me awake. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining my ears. The night in the Columbia Britannica had been serene, filled with distant owl calls and the occasional rustle of wind through the pine needles. But now a new noise had entered. Deliberate footsteps, slow, as if something was pacing around our campsite. "Maria," Lara whispered next to me, her voice tight with fear. "Do you hear that?" I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I hear it." My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness of the tent, every sense on high alert. We hadn't expected to find anything more than solitude on this trip, just a couple of friends seeking some distance from the chaos of the city. The steps circled the tent slowly, and I could feel my stomach knotting up. It wasn't a bear. I knew what a bear sounded like, knew the heavy, lumbering gait. This was different, calculated, almost like whatever it was curious. It felt intentional. "What do we do?" Lara asked, her voice barely audible, trembling. I reached for her hand in the dark and gave it a quick, reassuring squeeze, though I had no idea how to answer her. My eyes darted towards the flap of the tent, watching the faintest outline of a shadow pass by. Tall, too tall for a person. I held my breath, and suddenly all the camping gear we had brought with us felt insufficient, nothing that could help in this moment. "Stay quiet," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "Maybe it'll leave." The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, silence returned, a thick, heavy silence that felt suffocating. I could feel every muscle in my body tensed, my grip on Lara's hand tight enough to hurt. Then we heard it. A sniffing sound, something brushing against the tent fabric. My heart hammered, and I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. I'd heard stories, rumors from old-timers, whispers in the mountaineering community about things seen in these woods. A part of me had always dismissed them, chalking them up to campfire tales meant to frighten newcomers. But now, with whatever this was just inches away, I wasn't so sure. The shadow moved again, slowly passing around the side of the tent, and I heard the crunch of leaves, a deep exhale that almost sounded annoyed. I couldn't stop myself from imagining it, a massive figure, covered in matted hair, with eyes that held something that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human either. My imagination, fueled by fear, was painting a vivid, nightmarish picture. Lara squeezed my hand back, her breath shaky. "Maria, I'm scared." I bit my lip, my eyes glued to the shadow. "I know. Just stay still. Don't move." Minutes passed, each one dragging on endlessly, and slowly, painfully, the sound of footsteps began to recede. I could hear the soft rustle of branches, the crackle of leaves as whatever it was moved away from us, back towards the depths of the forest. I didn't dare move until the sound had faded completely, and even then I waited, every nerve still buzzing with tension. Finally, I exhaled, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Lara was trembling, her hand still clutched in mine, and I turned towards her, barely able to make out her features in the dark. "I think it's gone," I whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide, glistening with tears. "What was that?" I shook my head, the reality of what had just happened still settling in. "I don't know, but we need to leave. At first light, we're out of here." Lara nodded again, swallowing hard. "You think it'll come back?" I didn't have an answer for that, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I reached for the flashlight by my side, flicking it on and shining it towards the tent flap. The small beam seemed almost pathetic against the darkness beyond, but it brought some semblance of comfort, however fragile. I unzipped the flap slowly, the noise loud in the stillness, and shone the light outside. The clearing was empty. The fire pit, now just a few smouldering embers, cast long shadows, and the surrounding trees loomed over us like silent guardians. There was no sign of whatever had been out there, no movement, no glowing eyes peering from the underbrush, just the heavy darkness of the early hours. "I don't see anything," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. Lara sat up beside me, her eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "Are you sure?" "No," I admitted, swallowing the fear that threatened to spill over. "But I think we're okay for now." We both sat there, huddled in the tent, the flashlight beam our only source of comfort, and waited for the dawn. The night stretched on, the darkness seemingly endless. Every small noise setting my heart racing. Each rustle of wind, each creak of a tree was enough to bring back the fear, the memory of that massive shadow outside our tent. When the first light of morning finally broke, it felt like a weight had lifted off my chest. The forest, once menacing, now seemed almost tranquil in the soft glow of dawn. The birds had returned, their calls echoing through the trees, and the rustle of the leaves in the breeze was no longer something to fear, but something familiar, comforting. We packed up in silence, neither of us saying much, the fear of the night still fresh in our minds. Lara's hands were shaking as she rolled up her sleeping bag, her eyes constantly flicking towards the tree line, as if expecting to see that shadow again. "Do you think we should tell someone?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. I paused, looking around the clearing, at the tracks, faint impressions in the earth, too large to be human, leading away into the forest. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Who would believe us?" She nodded, her expression grim. "You're right, they'd just say it was a bear or something." I sighed, slinging my pack over my shoulders, the weight settling against my back. "Maybe it's better if we just leave it be. Whatever it was, it let us go." Lara looked at me, her eyes wide, haunted. "But what if it doesn't let the next people go?" I didn't have an answer for that, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. We started down the trail, the forest closing in around us, the sunlight filtering through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the path ahead. Every step took us further from the clearing, from whatever had watched us that night, but the fear didn't fade. It lingered just beneath the surface, a reminder that the wilderness still held secrets, things that didn't fit into our neat understanding of the world. As we reached the trailhead, I turned back, looking one last time towards the forest, towards the place where we had camped. The trees stood tall, silent, indifferent, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of movement between the trunks, a dark shape, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone, and I couldn't be sure if it had been real or just my imagination, playing tricks on me in the morning light. "Come on!" Lara called, her voice tight. "Let's go." I nodded, turning away, my heart heavy. We climbed into the car, and as I started the engine, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving something unfinished behind, something that would always be there, waiting, just beyond the edge of sight. The road wound away from the forest, the trees eventually giving way to open fields, the sunlight growing stronger with each passing mile. But even as the distance grew, I knew this wasn't the end. I knew deep down that someday I'd be back, because there were questions that still needed answers, fears that needed facing, and the forest, with all its secrets, was waiting. Story 16. The chill of the Montana morning was sharp, the kind that nipped at your skin no matter how many layers you wore. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, my boots crunching through the snow, each step muffled by the thick carpet of white that blanketed the forest floor. It was supposed to be a normal day, the kind of day I lived for, quiet, remote, just me and the trees. But that kind of peace never lasts long when the woods are hiding something. I'd been walking for about an hour when I came across the cabin. It was old, the kind of structure that had clearly seen better days, with its roof sagging under the weight of snow and windows boarded up. I paused. The sight unexpected. I'd scouted this area plenty of times, but I couldn't remember ever seeing it before. Something about the way it stood there, half lost in the forest, gave me pause. I walked closer, my eyes scanning the area. The snow was undisturbed, no footprints leading to the door, no signs that anyone had been there recently, just a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere. But then I saw the tracks, not leading to the cabin, but around it, like something had circled it. The prints were huge, like those of a bear, but different. I knelt down, brushing some of the snow away to get a better look. "What in the—" I whispered, my breath fogging in the cold air. The tracks were long, with toes clearly visible, but they weren't quite right. Bears had claw marks, and these looked more like a human's, just much, much bigger. I straightened, the unease settling into my chest like a stone. I glanced around, my senses suddenly on high alert. The trees were thick here, their branches heavy with snow, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the early morning light. My breath came in quick bursts, the air biting at my lungs as I listened, straining for any sound, any movement. A low, almost imperceptible groan came from somewhere deeper in the forest. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong, the kind that made your instincts flare, telling you to leave. Now, I tightened my grip on the rifle, taking a step back from the cabin. My eyes darted between the trees, every shadow seeming to shift, every patch of darkness a potential hiding spot. "Ahmed, you're just jumpy," I muttered to myself, though the words did little to calm the rising fear in my chest. I took another step back, then another, my boots crunching loudly in the quiet of the forest. Another sound, closer this time, a crack, like a branch snapping under weight. My pulse quickened, and I turned, moving away from the cabin, my eyes scanning the tree line. I didn't want to be there anymore. Whatever was making those sounds, I had no interest in meeting it. The snow made it hard to move quickly, each step sinking down, slowing me. My breath came faster, the cold air stinging my throat. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following, but there was nothing, just the empty forest, the trees standing tall and silent. I kept moving, following my own tracks back the way I'd come. The woods felt different now. The sense of isolation that I usually found comforting had turned into something else, something oppressive. It was as if the forest had eyes, watching my every move, waiting for me to slip. A sound to my right, a heavy crunch of snow, deliberate. I froze, my head snapping in the direction of the noise, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it was there. I could feel it, the presence, the weight of its gaze. My hands tightened around the rifle, my finger brushing the trigger. "Who's there?" I called, my voice rough, breaking the silence. No answer, just the echo of my own words bouncing off the trees. I swallowed, the dryness in my throat making it hard to breathe. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches above, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a shape, dark and large, slipping between the trees. My gut twisted, fear clawing at me, and I turned, pushing forward, my feet moving faster now, almost running. I had to get out, had to make it back to the car, to somewhere that didn't feel like the forest was closing in around me. My feet pounded against the snow, the rifle bouncing against my shoulder with each step. The cold air burned my lungs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The forest thinned, and up ahead I could see the clearing, the open space where I'd parked. Relief surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, the muscles screaming in protest. I burst into the clearing, stumbling slightly, my feet slipping on the icy ground. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands trembling. I glanced back at the tree line, the shadows deep, and for just a second I saw it. A figure, standing there, half hidden behind a tree. It was massive, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I wrenched the car door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut, my breaths coming in panicked bursts. I locked the doors, my eyes still fixed on the forest. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste any time. I put the car in gear and drove, the tires skidding slightly on the icy ground before catching traction. As I drove away, the forest slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, the tall, dark pines giving way to open road. My hands were still shaking, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I could still see it in my mind, that figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I knew I wouldn't tell anyone about this, not because they wouldn't believe me, though I doubted they would, but because I didn't want to believe it myself. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, a refuge. But now, it felt different. Now, yes, it felt like something else was out there, something that didn't want me there. I took a deep breath, my eyes on the road ahead, the mountains rising in the distance. I wasn't sure if I'd come back, if I'd ever be able to walk those woods again without feeling that fear, that presence. But I knew one thing, whatever it was still out there, and it had seen me, and maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for me to return. Story 17. The cold air bit at my face as I adjusted the settings on my camera, my breath misting in the crisp Hokkaido afternoon. I was there to capture the raw beauty of the region, the wildlife, the winter stillness. The snow crunched under my boots as I shifted to get a better angle of the view ahead, the mountains framed perfectly in my lens. That's when I noticed it, a movement just beyond my field of focus, something dark, large, weaving between the trees. I blinked, pulling my face away from the camera, frowning slightly as I scanned the tree line. The shapes of branches and shadows blended seamlessly, but I could swear there had been something there, something more than just the shifting of the wind. My heart gave an involuntary thud, a primitive alarm from deep within, telling me I wasn't alone. Just a bear, I muttered to myself, trying to quell the unease as I glanced back through the lens. But as I focused, I saw it again, more distinct this time, a tall figure, dark and broad, moving upright, not with the lumbering gait of a bear, but with a stride that looked deliberate. My finger hovered over the shutter, frozen with uncertainty. Whatever it was, it stopped, half obscured by the trunks of a couple of trees, and turned towards me. I held my breath, adjusting the zoom, and that's when I caught a glimpse of its eyes, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the forest, like twin reflections. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly dropped the camera from my face, my eyes searching the forest with nothing but my own vision. The figure had vanished, or at least I couldn't see it anymore. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wasn't prone to fear. I'd spent countless days and nights alone in remote locations, capturing images of wild animals and harsh landscapes. But there was something about this, the way it moved, the way it seemed to watch me, that made my skin crawl. Slowly, I packed up my camera, my eyes never leaving the forest edge. The snow-covered trees stood silent, indifferent, but the sense of being watched refused to leave. My instincts, usually attuned to the rhythms of the wild, were jangling with a dissonance I couldn't ignore. I slung the camera strap over my shoulder, my breath shallow, each exhale a puff of mist in the cold air. "Get a grip, Hiroshi," I muttered, shaking my head, but my hands were trembling slightly as I pulled my gloves back on. The sun was already beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, and I knew I needed to start heading back. I turned, setting a brisk pace, the snow crunching beneath my boots, every footfall sounding too loud in the thick silence. The forest loomed around me as I walked, the trees like dark pillars against the whitening sky. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my senses stretched taut, expecting to see that figure again, to see it following, slipping from shadow to shadow. But there was nothing. Only the creak of branches in the wind, the occasional distant caw of a raven, the muffled thud of snow sliding from a branch. I had almost convinced myself that it had been my imagination, a trick of the light, when I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible noise, like a deep exhale. I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came again, closer this time, and I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the underbrush. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it again. Tall, dark, standing unnaturally still. My heart pounded as I took a step back, the snow crunching beneath my boot. Its eyes caught the fading light once more, and they locked onto mine, unblinking. There was an intelligence there. Something that sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. For a moment, I was paralyzed, caught between the urge to capture the image, to bring my camera up and take the shot, and the more pressing, primal urge to run. My fingers twitched towards the camera, and the figure shifted, a subtle, fluid movement that spoke of power held in check. That broke the spell. I turned, my feet moving before my brain had fully caught up, pushing through the snow as fast as I could without breaking into a full-out run. Running from a predator was the surest way to trigger a chase. I knew that. But every instinct screamed at me to put distance between myself and whatever was watching me from the shadows. The trees blurred past, the cold air biting at my face, my lungs burning as I forced myself onward. The landscape that had seemed so serene, so welcoming just hours before, now felt menacing, each shadow a potential hiding place for whatever that thing was. I could hear my heartbeat, loud and frantic, every breath a cloud of panic that hung in the cold air. I glanced back once, just once, and my stomach dropped. It was there, moving between the trees, keeping pace, its form slipping in and out of view, like a spectre. I faced forward again, focusing on my path, the outline of the cabin I was staying at finally coming into sight through the trees. A burst of adrenaline carried me the last few 100 meters, the snow kicking up around my boots as I half ran, half stumbled towards the door. I reached the cabin, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch, finally throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, my chest heaving, the silence inside almost as overwhelming as the fear that still gripped me. I locked the door, sliding the bolt into place, and backed away, my eyes fixed on the small window that faced the forest. The light outside was fading fast, the sky turning a deep blue, the shadows growing longer. I stood there, waiting, expecting to see that dark figure step into the clearing, to see it watching me from the edge of the woods. But nothing moved. The forest was still, the only sound the wind against the cabin walls, the creak of the old wood settling. I finally let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving me exhausted. I moved to the window, peering out, my eyes scanning the tree line. There was nothing, no movement. No eyes reflecting back at me, just the trees, silent and indifferent, the snow covering the ground like a blanket. I stepped away, my hands still trembling as I set my camera on the table, the weight of it feeling strangely comforting. I replayed the images in my mind, the figure, the eyes, the way it had moved. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't anything I knew, and whatever it was, it had followed me, watched me, as if it were curious. I sank into the chair by the window, my eyes still darting towards the darkening forest, my mind racing. I had spent years photographing the wild, capturing moments of beauty and raw nature. But this was something else, something that didn't belong in the frame, something that refused to be neatly captured or explained. The night deepened, the darkness pressing in around the cabin, and I knew sleep would not come easily. Not with the memory of those eyes still fresh in my mind, not with the knowledge that somewhere out there, beyond the safety of these walls, something was waiting, watching. And as I sat there, the cold creeping in from the edges of the room, I knew one thing. I'd be back, not because I wanted to, not because I was fearless, but because the mystery of it called to me, a pull I couldn't quite ignore. Whatever was out there, whatever watched from the shadows of the Hokkaido forest, I needed to understand it, and I knew that understanding would come at a price. The wind howled outside, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Tomorrow, I'd leave. I'd pack up and head back to civilization, put distance between myself and this place. But one day, I'd return. Because there were questions that needed answers, and photographs that still needed to be taken, and perhaps next time, I'd be ready. Story 18. It was supposed to be a quiet morning, the kind I craved. I had my binoculars slung around my neck, my notebook in my hand, and the Ohio woods spread out before me, promising the comfort of familiar bird calls and rustling leaves. Birdwatching had always been my escape, a way to disconnect from the world, to lose myself in the simple, mesmerizing beauty of nature. But as I scanned the trees that morning, a flicker of movement caught my eye, something that made my breath hitch. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. My heart began to thump, an uneasy rhythm in my chest. I adjusted the binoculars, squinting into the underbrush, trying to see clearly what had shifted there. The figure was tall, bulky, and it moved in a way that was strangely deliberate, like it was aware of me watching. I swallowed hard, the binoculars heavy in my shaking hands. It's just a deer, I told myself, but the words felt hollow. I'd seen deer before. This was different. My breath misted in the cold air as I stood there, staring, watching the shadow move behind the trees. I forced myself to focus, to find the familiar comfort in identifying what it was. But my mind wouldn't let go of the gnawing fear. Then it happened again. That flicker of movement. The shadow shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something. It wasn't fur. It wasn't quite human. My gut clenched, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I lowered the binoculars, my breath coming faster. The morning had been calm, but now there was an unnatural stillness to the woods, the kind that made the silence feel heavy. No birds, no wind. It was like the entire forest had gone still, waiting. I took a step back, my boot crunching softly against the forest floor, and the sound seemed deafening. Whatever was there, it had stopped moving. I could feel it now, the weight of eyes on me, something, someone watching. My pulse raced, and I glanced around, my eyes darting between the dark trunks of the trees. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper. The echo of my own voice was the only response, bouncing off the trees before disappearing into the stillness. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the strap of my binoculars. A rustle came from my left, a deliberate sound, the crack of a branch underfoot. I turned sharply, my heart pounding, and I saw it, a glimpse of a face, partially obscured by the leaves, staring at me, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was there and it was watching. I didn't wait. I turned, my legs moving before my mind caught up, pushing me forward, away from whatever was hiding in the shadows. My breaths came in short, panicked bursts, the trees blurring around me as I made my way back towards the path, towards somewhere that felt safe. The weight of its gaze didn't leave, and every step I took, I expected to hear it. That heavy crunch of something following. The clearing came into view up ahead, the open space promising a break from the pressing presence of the trees. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, and broke into the clearing, stumbling to a stop, my breath ragged. I turned, my eyes scanning the edge of the forest, searching for any sign that I was being followed. Nothing, just the empty woods, the trees standing still and silent. I swallowed, my throat dry, my heart still pounding in my chest. I took a step back, then another, my eyes still fixed on the tree line. The sense of being watched didn't fade, even in the open air. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching, just beyond the line of trees, hidden in the shadows. I forced myself to turn away, to focus on the path that led back to my car. The woods had always felt like a safe haven to me, a place where I could lose myself in the beauty of nature. But now, it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier, like the forest itself had secrets it didn't want me to find. My steps quickened as I followed the path, my breath still coming in uneven gasps. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, a trick of the light, my imagination getting the better of me, but deep down I knew it was more than that. I knew I had seen something that didn't belong. When I reached my car, I slipped inside, locking the doors almost without thinking. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the forest, my hands still trembling. The weight of what I'd seen settled heavily on my chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, it had seen me, and it had let me see it. As I started the engine, the hum of the car broke the stillness, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. I took a deep breath, my eyes lingering on the tree line for just a moment longer before I pulled away. The car rolling slowly down the dirt road. The forest disappeared behind me, swallowed by distance, but the feeling remained. The unease, the sense that I had glimpsed something I shouldn't have, something that didn't want to be found. And I knew that no matter how far I drove, that feeling would stay with me, a reminder that the woods held secrets, and that some things were better left unseen. Story 19. The Alaskan wilderness always had a way of swallowing sound, turning even the loudest of noises into nothing more than whispers lost in the vastness. I was out on a night patrol, flashlight cutting through the dark, my breath visible in the crisp, biting air. The snow crunched under my boots, the cold wrapping itself around me like an old familiar friend. Tonight was supposed to be routine, just another lonely shift, making sure everything was as it should be. But nothing about tonight felt right. There were tracks near the riverbank, deep, heavy impressions in the snow, almost like something big had moved through not long ago. I crouched down, running my gloved fingers along the edges of one of the prints, frowning at its size. It wasn't like any bear print I'd seen, and I'd seen plenty. The weight behind it, the way it had crushed the snow, it was something else entirely. I straightened up, shining my flashlight across the dark stretch of the river, the beam catching on the glistening surface of the ice. The wind carried a sound then, something distant but unmistakable, a long, low wail that rose and fell, echoing across the empty expanse. My heart skipped a beat, my breath caught in my throat. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, a mix of something almost human but guttural, wild. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly as I scanned the tree line, my instincts screaming that I wasn't alone. "Derek, get a grip," I muttered under my breath, my voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around my face. But even as I said it, I knew something was out there. The usual night sounds, the scuttling of small creatures, the creak of branches in the breeze, were gone, replaced by a silence that was too deep, too deliberate. I started to back away from the river, my boots crunching in the snow, my eyes darting between the trees, the shadows playing tricks on my vision. The flashlight's beam wavered, and for a split second I thought I saw movement, something tall and dark slipping between the trunks just at the edge of the light. I paused, my grip tightening on the flashlight, straining to see. Then I heard it again, closer this time, that same eerie wail, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest, setting every nerve on edge. It was closer. I could feel it now, the presence, the weight of eyes watching me from somewhere in the darkness. I swallowed hard, the adrenaline kicking in, my body tensing with the instinct to either fight or flee. "Hello!" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The word felt hollow, swallowed up by the cold, empty air. There was no response, just the creak of the trees as they swayed, and that horrible silence pressing in on me from all sides. I took another step back, then another, each one deliberate, slow. I couldn't afford to turn my back, not now. My eyes flickered between the trees, catching glimpses of shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. My breath was coming faster now, the cold burning in my lungs, and then there it was, clearer this time. A figure, massive, stepping out from behind one of the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight. It was tall, easily taller than any man, with broad shoulders, and it moved with a strange fluidity that made my stomach twist. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of fear than anything else, my voice shaky. The figure paused, its head turning slightly, as if it was acknowledging me. My heart hammered in my chest, the reality of the situation hitting me all at once. This wasn't just an animal. This was something else, something that shouldn't be here. I took another step back, my flashlight beam catching on what looked like eyes, reflective, almost glowing in the dark. They watched me, unblinking, and I could feel an intelligence behind them, something calculating, something that made my skin crawl. The figure shifted again, and I could see the outline of its body, covered in dark fur, its breath misting in the cold air. Panic gripped me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and started to move, fast but careful, my boots slipping slightly on the snow as I made my way back towards the trail that led to the ranger station. My flashlight bobbed with each step, the beam casting wild, flickering shadows that seemed to dance around me. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud, the blood pounding in my ears. Behind me, the wail came again, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. It was following me. The realization sent a surge of fear through me, and I picked up my pace, my legs aching as I pushed through the snow, the cold air biting at my face. I couldn't look back, didn't dare. Every instinct I had screamed to keep moving, to not let whatever it was close the distance. The lights of the ranger station finally came into view, a warm glow that seemed almost out of place in the cold, unforgiving wilderness. I stumbled towards them, my breath coming in gasps, my fingers numb as I reached for the radio clipped to my jacket. "Base, this is Derek," I managed, my voice barely a whisper, my throat tight. I need backup. "Something's out here." The radio crackled to life, a burst of static followed by a voice. Calm, too calm for what I was feeling. "Derek, what's your situation? Can you identify the animal?" I glanced back towards the tree line, my heart pounding. The figure had stopped at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows, its eyes still fixed on me. I swallowed hard, my breath clouding in the air. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't. I don't know what it is. It's not a bear. It's something else." "Roger that, Derek. Hold your position. Backup is en route." I nodded, even though they couldn't see me, my eyes locked on the figure at the edge of the clearing. It stood there for a moment longer, its breath misting, and then, slowly, it turned, melting back into the darkness of the forest, disappearing between the trees as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts, my body trembling from more than just the cold. The radio crackled again, the voice asking for an update, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the tree line. The forest was quiet once more, the wind rustling through the branches, the snow lying undisturbed. Whatever it was gone now. But the fear remained, a gnawing sense of unease that settled deep in my gut. I knew these woods, knew the animals that called them home, the sounds and sights that were normal, expected. But this had been something different, something that didn't belong. I turned slowly, making my way towards the station, the warmth of the lights finally wrapping around me as I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. I leaned against it, my eyes closing, the tension slowly beginning to ebb away. But even as I stood there, safe inside, I knew that whatever I'd seen tonight wasn't over. It was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting, and somehow I knew that I'd see it again. Story 20. The night air was crisp, clinging to my skin in a way that made me acutely aware of the darkness around me. I sat by the river in Idaho, the soft murmur of water playing a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. Fishing at night was supposed to be a meditative escape, a chance to be alone under the stars, away from everything and everyone. But as the river lapped quietly at the banks and the full moon cast its silver glow on the water, a sense of unease began to creep into the edges of my mind. It started with a splash, louder than any fish I'd heard before. I paused, my fingers tightening around the handle of my fishing rod. It wasn't the usual rippling of trout breaking the surface or the slow lap of water against the rocks. This was something else, something that sounded heavy, deliberate. My eyes flicked across the river, searching the dark expanse for movement. Probably just a beaver, I muttered to myself, though the words rang hollow in the still night air. The unease settled deeper into my chest, gnawing at me as the seconds stretched into silence again. The splash had been close, too close, like something had moved just out of my line of sight. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping tension. I focused back on my line, adjusting it with numb fingers, my eyes fixed on the moonlit water. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves around me, and I tried to let the sound wash over me, pushing away the anxiety. But the peace I sought felt farther away with each passing moment, the quiet of the night suddenly feeling like a weight pressing down on me. And then I heard it again, another splash, this time followed by a subtle rippling, as if something large was moving through the river, just beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned my head slowly, my eyes straining to make out anything in the dim light. The river gleamed silver, the ripples expanding outward in perfect, deliberate circles. My heart began to pound, each beat reverberating in my ears. Something was out there, and it wasn't just a beaver. My fingers clenched around the rod, my knuckles whitening. I peered closer, leaning forward slightly, my instincts urging me to stay quiet, to listen. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like a guttural exhale, came from somewhere near the water's edge, and my blood ran cold. I knew the sounds of the river, knew the creatures that inhabited these parts, but this was different. There was something almost human about it, something that spoke of intent. I swallowed hard, my breath fogging in the cool night air as I tried to keep calm. "Hello?" The words slipped out before I could stop it, barely a whisper against the rushing of the river. No response. I listened, straining for any hint of movement, any indication that I wasn't alone. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating, as if the whole world had decided to hold its breath. Another splash, closer this time, and I jerked back, my pulse spiking with fear. I stood up quickly, nearly tripping over my tackle box as I backed away from the riverbank. My eyes darted left and right, scanning the darkness, trying to make sense of what was happening. There, just beyond the edge of the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of something, a silhouette, large and dark, slipping silently into the water. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the fear now a tight knot in my stomach. It had been too big, too deliberate in its movements. This wasn't an animal I could explain away. The rational part of my brain tried to offer explanations. A bear, maybe. But deep down, I knew that whatever I'd seen, whatever had exhaled in that low, almost sentient way, wasn't a bear. I forced myself to move, gathering my things quickly, my hands trembling. The rod, the tackle, the small camp chair, I grabbed it all, my eyes never leaving the river. I could still see the ripples, the water moving in a way that told me whatever was beneath it was still there, lurking, watching. "Time to go, Isaac," I whispered, trying to steady my voice, trying to convince myself that I was still in control. My boots crunched against the gravel as I turned, moving away from the water, my body tense with the expectation of something, anything, bursting from the river behind me. I made my way up the bank, the slope slippery beneath my feet. I could feel the presence of the river at my back, the unease following me even as I left the water behind. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked my truck, I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. I fumbled with the keys, glancing back at the trail that led to the river. The darkness was deeper there, the shadows almost impenetrable. I could still hear the water moving, still see those ripples expanding outward in my mind's eye, as vivid as if they were right in front of me. I climbed into the truck, slamming the door shut, my breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. I locked the doors, my fingers stiff with cold and fear, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the trail in front of me, the light bouncing off the trunks of the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something at the edge of the beams, a figure, tall and unmoving, standing just beyond the reach of the light. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The truck rumbled as I put it into gear, the tires crunching over the gravel, and I drove, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The fear still clung to me. The memory of that shadow in the water, the sound of that exhale. It was as if the river itself had come alive, something ancient and hidden, rising to the surface just long enough for me to glimpse it. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, the forest finally giving way to open fields, the sense of isolation slowly fading. I let out a long breath, my body slumping slightly as the tension began to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I glanced in the rearview mirror, the darkness of the woods now a distant line against the night sky. "What the hell was that?" I muttered to myself, the words barely audible over the hum of the engine. No answer came, just the soft thrum of the tires on the road, the night stretching endlessly ahead. I knew I wouldn't be coming back to that spot anytime soon. The river, once a place of solitude and calm, now felt different, as if it held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe there were things out there, lurking in the dark corners of the world, that were better left alone, better left unseen. As I drove on, the stars above glittering coldly in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that river had seen me, had known I was there, and as much as I wanted to forget it, to chalk it up to exhaustion or imagination, I knew that wasn't possible. The image of those ripples, of that shadow slipping beneath the water, was burned into my mind, a reminder that sometimes the world is far stranger than we want to believe. Story 21. It was barely past dawn when I made my way into the forest, the mist clinging to the underbrush and the early light turning everything a soft, golden hue. My boots sank into the damp earth, and I adjusted my backpack, the cased camera bouncing lightly against my hip. I was alone, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I had data to collect for the study, and the quiet hours before anyone else woke up were my favorite, a chance to slip into a world where it was just me and the wildlife. I stopped near a clearing and knelt to place a motion-activated camera on a tree, making sure it faced a well-worn animal trail. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that today felt different. The birdsong was there, and yet the forest seemed tense. It was subtle, a shift in the air, an unease that made me pause more than once to glance over my shoulder. "It's just you, Chloe," I muttered under my breath, my fingers adjusting the straps that held the camera in place. I forced a smile, trying to dismiss the growing sense of unease. There was nothing out there that hadn't always been. I tightened the last strap and stood up, brushing dirt off my jeans. Then from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy knocking against wood. I froze, my body tensing as I strained to listen. The sound echoed through the quiet, coming from the direction where the trees grew denser, where the light barely broke through. It wasn't a woodpecker. I knew that immediately. It was slower, deliberate, with a strange cadence that set my nerves on edge. I straightened, squinting into the shadows, my heart starting to pound a little faster. The rational part of my brain offered explanations, a branch swaying in the wind, maybe someone working deeper in the forest. But deep down, I knew better. I was alone. No one came out here this early. All right, get it together, I whispered to myself, taking a deep breath. My hand moved instinctively to the camera, checking that it was secure before I turned my back on the sound, forcing myself to move back towards the trail. The thumping continued, faint and steady, as if marking my retreat. I had almost made it back to the path when the noise stopped, and a silence even heavier than before fell over the woods. I paused, glancing over my shoulder, a chill prickling at the base of my neck. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm, and I could feel the pulse of it in my bones. "Hello," I called, my voice louder than I intended, breaking the stillness. It echoed through the trees, but there was no answer, only the rustle of leaves as a breeze moved through them. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but my curiosity, that damned curiosity that always got me into trouble, made me take a step towards the direction of the sound instead. I adjusted my grip on my pack, swallowing the lump of fear that had lodged itself in my throat. I knew I should go back, but my feet carried me deeper into the woods, the shadows growing longer around me. I picked my way through the underbrush, moving carefully, every step a gamble against whatever might be waiting beyond the next tree. The forest was dense here, the light filtering through the branches in thin, weak strands, and I found myself holding my breath, listening for anything, any sign of movement. My fingers brushed against the camera at my hip, my thumb running along the shutter button, ready. Then ahead of me I saw it. A clearing that shouldn't have been there, a place I hadn't seen on any of the maps I had studied. I hesitated at the edge, my heart pounding. Something was off about the clearing. It was almost perfectly circular, the grass flattened in strange patterns, as if something heavy had been moving through it. My eyes were drawn to the center where a tree stood, tall, thick, with deep scratches running down its trunk, the bark peeled away in long, deliberate strips. My breath caught in my chest as I stepped closer, my eyes locked on the scratches. They were fresh. The exposed wood beneath the bark was pale, almost wet-looking. Whatever had made them was strong, much stronger than any animal I knew lived in these woods. I took a few steps forward, lifting my camera, my hands trembling slightly as I framed the shot. A sound, barely audible, made me stop, a rustling, like something shifting in the underbrush behind me. I spun around, the camera clutched to my chest, my eyes wide, scanning the trees. The shadows were deep, impenetrable, and I couldn't see anything. But I knew I wasn't alone. The air had shifted again, that sense of being watched pressing in on me from all sides. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. I hated the fear in it, hated how small I felt surrounded by the towering trees. Silence answered me. The kind of silence that was almost loud, a presence in itself. I took a step back, then another, my eyes still scanning the tree line. And then, just at the edge of my vision, I saw it, a figure, tall, dark, barely more than a shadow against the deeper darkness of the woods. It moved slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that spoke of something intelligent, something that knew I was there. My mouth went dry and I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, nearly sending me sprawling. I caught myself, the camera slipping from my grasp, dangling from its strap as I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the earth, the forest a blur around me, branches whipping at my face. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air burning in my lungs as I pushed myself harder, the path a twisting, narrow escape through the endless trees. I didn't stop until I saw the glint of metal through the trees, my car parked at the edge of the woods, the sight of it like a lifeline pulling me out of the nightmare. I burst into the clearing, nearly collapsing against the side of the vehicle, my fingers fumbling with the keys. I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge, watching, waiting. But there was nothing, just the trees, tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened, as if the forest hadn't just swallowed me whole and spit me back out. I climbed into the car, slamming the door shut, my breaths coming in uneven, shaky bursts. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine, the roar of it breaking the stillness. I put the car in gear and drove, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The forest slowly receding into the distance, the shadows growing smaller until they were nothing more than a blur against the horizon. I didn't know what I had seen, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The woods, once a place of solace, now felt foreign, like they were holding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my mind replaying the sight of that clearing, the scratches, the figure. Whatever it was, it had been there, and it had watched me. And as much as I wanted to forget it, I knew I wouldn't, that the image of that tree, of those deep, deliberate scratches, would stay with me. A reminder that the forest wasn't just a place of peace. It was something else, something alive, something that watched and waited, and sometimes, if you weren't careful, it let you see it. Story 22. The wind at high altitude has a distinct sound, a whistle that can make even the bravest climber feel small. I had always loved that sound, the way it carried across the open space, touching the peaks of the Montana mountains and disappearing into the horizon. It was meant to be just another climb, another check on my growing list of ascents. But the day started to unravel into something else, something I hadn't bargained for. The moment I reached the ridge, I paused, taking a deep breath and leaning on my ice axe for support. Below, the valley spread out in endless green and grey, a patchwork of evergreens and rocky outcrops. The sense of accomplishment I usually felt at this height didn't come. Instead, a strange feeling settled over me, the sensation that I wasn't alone. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as nothing more than the altitude playing tricks on my mind. "Get a grip, Ethan," I muttered under my breath, adjusting my pack and squinting into the distance. The sky was a perfect cloudless blue, and the sun blazed brightly, warming the exposed rock. Everything seemed right, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It crawled up my spine, a nagging awareness that something was off. I moved on, each step deliberate, my boots crunching over the frost-covered rocks. The ridge ahead narrowed, and I slowed down, my eyes scanning the landscape. I didn't see anything, just rocks and snow, the occasional bird circling above, but the feeling persisted. It was as if I was being watched, as if there were eyes somewhere in the vast emptiness, locked on me. A noise echoed through the stillness, a sound like a rock being overturned. I paused, my head snapping towards the source, my heart skipping a beat. It came from further along the ridge, from behind a massive boulder that jutted out like a giant's broken tooth. My instincts told me to turn back, to put as much distance between me and whatever had made that noise. But my curiosity got the better of me. I approached slowly, my hands tightening around the ice axe, my breath coming in short bursts. The wind had died down, leaving the mountain eerily silent, and every crunch of my boots seemed to echo in the emptiness. I rounded the boulder, peering around it, my body tense. There, in the snow, were footprints, large, deep impressions that led away from the boulder and towards a narrow pass further up the ridge. They weren't human. They were too big, the shape all wrong, with elongated toes that pressed deep into the snow. My gut twisted, a mix of fear and disbelief crashing over me. "No way!" I whispered, my breath fogging in the cold air. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting. But there was no one, only the footprints, leading away into the mountains, disappearing beyond the rocks. I knelt down, touching the edge of one of the prints, my fingers brushing against the packed snow. It was fresh. Whatever had made these prints had been here recently, maybe just minutes before I arrived. I straightened, my eyes following the trail as it wound up the ridge. My radio crackled to life, the sudden noise making me jump. I fumbled for it, bringing it up to my mouth. "Ethan here, go ahead," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Ethan, just checking in," came Sam's voice, tinny and distorted through the static. "You're at the ridge yet?" I hesitated, my eyes still on the tracks. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm here. Just saw something weird." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Weird how?" I licked my lips, debating whether to tell him. "Footprints," I said finally. "Big ones. Not sure what made them." Static crackled, and then Sam's voice again, cautious. "Bear." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Bears didn't make prints like these." There was something about the shape, the way the toes pressed into the snow, that felt wrong. "I don't know, just keep an ear out, okay?" "You got it," Sam said, his tone shifting to something lighter, trying to ease the tension. "Don't go getting yourself lost up there, all right? We're supposed to grab a beer tonight, remember?" I managed a smile, even though my heart was still pounding. Yeah, I'll be fine." I clipped the radio back to my belt, my eyes drifting back to the tracks. I knew I should turn back, head down the ridge, but something made me stay. A pull, a need to know what was out there. I followed the footprints, my steps careful, my eyes scanning the ridge ahead. The wind picked up again, a cold gust that whipped at my jacket, but I ignored it, my focus on the tracks. They led me to the edge of the ridge, where the mountain dropped off into a steep, rocky slope. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The tracks ended abruptly, right at the edge. I stared, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Whatever had made them had either jumped or disappeared. My skin prickled, a chill running down my spine. The emptiness below seemed to stretch on forever, the valley far beneath shrouded in mist. A sound, faint and distant, reached my ears. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, carried on the wind. I turned, my eyes wide, searching the ridge behind me, but there was nothing. Just the rocks, the snow, the endless sky. The growl came again, closer this time, and I felt my pulse spike, fear clawing at me. "Nope," I muttered, shaking my head. "Nope, nope, nope." I turned, my legs moving before my brain could catch up, pushing me back along the ridge, away from the edge, away from whatever was out there. My breaths came fast, my heart pounding in my ears as I moved. The wind whipped at my face, the cold biting into my skin, but I didn't slow down. I needed to get back to the path, back to where the mountain felt familiar, where I knew every rock and crevice. The growl echoed again, and I swore it was following me, keeping pace with my hurried steps. Finally, I saw the marker for the trailhead, the metal post barely visible against the rocky backdrop. I pushed myself harder, my muscles aching, my lungs burning. I reached the post, skidding to a stop, my hands gripping the cold metal as I looked back over my shoulder. The ridge was empty, no movement, no sound, just the endless stretch of rock and snow, bathed in the bright, indifferent light of the sun. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in uneven gasps, my mind racing. Whatever had been out there, whatever had made those tracks, it was gone now, vanished, as if it had never been. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to turn away, to focus on the path ahead. I needed to get down, to get off this mountain, to put as much distance between me and whatever was up there as possible. My radio crackled again, and I grabbed it, my voice trembling as I spoke. "Sam, it's Ethan. I'm heading down," I said. I think I've had enough for today." There was a pause. Then Sam's voice, calm and steady. "You all right, man?" I hesitated, my eyes drifting back up the ridge one last time. "Yeah," I said, though the word felt like a lie. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just ready to be done." "Copy that," Sam said. "See you at the bottom." I clipped the radio back to my belt, my hands still trembling as I started down the trail. The mountain, once a place of challenge and thrill, now felt different, as if it had secrets, as if it was alive, watching, waiting. And as I descended, the wind carrying the faint echoes of something I couldn't understand, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was up there, it had seen me, and it had let me go. This time,